Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning and good evening, wherever you're based. My name is Guido Guarducci. I'm the co-director of CAMNES. And on behalf from me, obviously, and my colleague, co-director Stefano Valentini, as well as the curators of this event, Professor Nicola Laneri and Anna Perdibon, we would like to welcome you to the Sacred Nature Online International Workshop, Animism, Materiality, and Ancient Religions. Welcome you all. Welcome to the speakers. Welcome to the listeners. And welcome to the viewers that are following us in streaming on our YouTube channel. We would like to thank you greatly for your participation. We would like to thank you for the speakers for their contributions, at least from the titles and the abstracts that are very promising, as well as to the listeners for their enthusiasm, because when we activated online registration, within just a few hours, we filled our 80 spaces. So I guess this topic is very interesting for a lot of you. So thank you. I thank you again for this. And thank you for being here, although virtually all together. Okay. Before leaving the floor to Professor Nicola Laneri and starting our event, I would like to just read a few words I wrote down as soon as I was aware of this topic. I was informed, and which I find extremely interesting, also because it has different kinds of, we could say, collateral topics. Okay, humans have always been a part of nature, perfectly intermingled and harmoniously bonded one to another. Nature, due to its nourishing and vital effects on one side and its mysterious and powerful attributes on the other, has always been sacred for man. Nature has always been a fundamental part of our lives, which brought prosperity and at the same time fearfulness, due to its unpredictability and mightiness. Hence, sacred. That is separated from normality, a respectful symbiosis that traveled on a fragile balance for millennia. Then everything changed. It may seem banal and trite to underline the process of separation, or better, secularization of man from its sacred environment, its independence from Mother Nature, a process that started in the Neolithic, if not earlier, with the first attempts of resource control and independence. Throughout antiquity, with the birth of the first cities and the organization of society. And finally, fully achieved with the 19th century industrialization. Industrialization was the turning point where we completed secession. What came after is a refinement of that independence. But if we look closely, we can clearly see that we have not fully separated. We actually inverted the relationship in a one-way, unbalanced, egocentric, and destructive process of exploitation. We do not take what we necessitate, we take everything. We do not use the resources of nature that provides us, we abuse them, slowly and inevitably consuming and eliminating all other life forms. The awareness that this process is erasing nature, hence at a certain point ourselves, has only recently become palpable. People are truly taking action in modifying their footprint. Also because, we must admit, for many it is trendy to do so. Perhaps a frivolous motivation, but with a positive impact. The recent COVID-19 pandemic has increased this awareness, but especially paused our frenzy and brought under our attention our relationship with nature. Not only respect and care, but mainly a reintegration with its manifestations, a harmonious reestablishment of synergy as a new form of spirituality for the new millennium and hopefully beyond. As a part of the spiritual healing process, we believe the study and understanding of the ancient roots of this symbiosis embodied in its tangible media is a fundamental step along this journey. We truly hope this workshop and its proceedings represent a small block in the building of this new awareness, as well as in the process of human identity reconstruction. Thank you for your attention. So I would like to now leave the floor to Professor Nicola Laneri. Thank you.
Thank you, Guido. I would like to thank, first of all, Dr. Guarducci and Dr. Valentini, because it's thanks to their idea of creating CAMNES that in 2017, we brought in the creation of School of Religious Studies. Since that date, we were able to create a new program in religious studies at CAMNES and the Lorenzo de' Medici Institution that increasingly saw about 100 and 115 students every semester. In 2019, I decided to invest all my efforts in creating a new series, material studies in material religion in antiquity, that it's going to be open with the first volume of this series, the Maria series, that will be dedicated to sacred body, and that will be published within a couple of weeks by Oxbow and Casman. Following this line, my idea was to promote the publication of other volumes of this series. And thanks to the involvement of Anna Perdibone, that did her PhD in Israel on animism in ancient Near East, I thought and I decided to promote a new subject that is sacred nature after sacred body. And Casimir Oxbow decided to follow my idea. And so we're going to publish the proceedings of this workshop in 2022 as the second volume of the series. As Guido said, the interest in the relationship between spiritual forces, nature and materiality is becoming more and more a fundamental interest in archaeology as well as religious studies. And I think material religion should become a pivotal element in studying ancient religions, both the classical and the New World. And we hope in the future, before the publication, to include also one or two more papers dedicated to this subject concerning the New World. So I'm very excited for this conference, and I really hope that the structure of this workshop will stimulate discussion among us, and also there are some students from Italy and also the Middle East and Europe and the US. And I really hope through the discussion, we will increase the quality of the future publication, because I think it will be interesting to create a publication that's based on this kind of events and workshops. So I leave the floor to the organizer of this workshop, Anna Perdibone, that will describe how we will continue today and then tomorrow, starting at 3 p.m. on the same platform, Zoom platform. Thank you, Anna, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicola. So thank you, everybody. And I wish to welcome you all to this exciting workshop. I mean, for me, it's very exciting. And I first of all wish to thank Nicola Laneri and, of course, Guido Guarducci and Stefano Valentini for welcoming with such an enthusiasm and promoting this idea of this workshop on sacred nature, on animism, and on materiality in ancient religions. So I thank them for the support, for the team organization, and for making all this possible. I warmly welcome all our speakers that I'm really excited to virtually meet you all today. Unfortunately, only virtually, but who knows the future. And for your exciting and very promising contributions that I'm very much looking forward to listen to and to learn from. Of course, my warmest thanks also to all the participants, both in Zoom and on the YouTube right now. And together with Nicola, Stefano, and Guido, we were really surprised and amazed by the really wide interest into this workshop. And so we're really excited for this. Before entering the midst of sacred nature and ancient religions, I would like to say just a few words about the practicals. I see that already most of you are mute and the video is switched off. So thank you for this, because it will enhance the connection. Of course, when we will have the sessions, the Q&A sessions at the end of each afternoons, that we hope there will be, 30 minutes, even more, richer. Yeah, you're more than welcome to pop in with your video and your microphone, or of course use the chat. Unfortunately, today one of our speakers, Massimo Cultraro, won't be able to be with us. So there was a sudden accident, I mean, not accident, but an unexpected event that didn't allow him to be with us, but he wishes all a great and successful workshop. Just another quick reminder, each speaker has around 30 minutes. The two keynotes has approximately 40 minutes. So because we wish to have, time for the session, for the discussion, I ask you to stick to the framework, to the schedule, and probably I will intrude if the time is approaching to an end. About now, I mean, today, because of this sudden change in the program, because we wish to keep, the same times for each speaker, we will probably have a longer break, but between Graham, Harvey's, and Laura Feld lecture, there won't be the break, so we will compact this as a session and then have some tea, some coffee, some stretching of our legs before starting for the second part of this afternoon. Now, I turn into my brief introduction to this workshop. Well, as also Nicola and Guido already stressed, and as most of you probably know, there is a growing interest and researches that are concerned with nature, religion, and culture that are really increasing and taking more and more shape and more relevance in the contemporary scholarship. Of course, this happens because of the renewed and even compelling interest in exploring the diverse, different human-environmental relations throughout the history of humans on the planet. And this is, of course, happening not just because of intellectual or academic interest, but because of the time that we're all in with this ongoing ecological crisis that is really creating also different offshoots and different streams of researches and interest in the humanities and the social sciences, and of course in the natural sciences. And I find it very interesting also this mingling and finally a dialogue between all these disciplines that is taking place. But what about ancient religions? Well, we know that also these notions of nature, culture, and also religion are critical and are currently being called into question from a variety of perspectives, especially the dualism, the dichotomy of culture and nature, and with the other dichotomies developed within the Euro-Western history of thought, are being reconsidered. In this respect, I think, and we think, that exploring non-modern and non-Western cultures and religions appears to be crucial in order to highlight the different ontologies, cosmologies, epistemologies, and religions. In this line, theories and approaches drawn from anthropology and ethnography are precious and should be understood and assumed as ways to allow us as scholars, as researchers, to interpret the multiplicity the phenomena that we call nature on the part of ancient religious cultures. Thus, the main goals of this workshop, Sacred Nature, Animism, and Materiality in Ancient Religions, aims at stirring up a starkly interdisciplinary and religious anthropological discussion about the diverse conceptions, representations, practices, and engagements toward what we call nature in ancient religions from both the Old and the New World. In particular, we wish to focus and explore together with you today and tomorrow the notions of animism and materiality as fruitful approaches for the interpretations and studies of ancient cultures regarding the encompassing landscapes and the other than human inhabitants. Animism, just a few introductions to the terms of animism and also of the notion of materiality. For those of you who perhaps don't chew this language too much already. Well, after the term animism has been dismissed due to its colonialistic and evolutionistic connotations, in the last decade, scholars of religion and anthropology reintroduced animism as a fruitful concept. Now, animism is a research field, or can be defined as a research field and as an approach that explores relational ontologies, cosmologies, and religions in the past and in the present. According to Graham Harvey, thanks for being here, animists recognize that the world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life is always lived in relationship with others. With personhood being acknowledged in spirits, deities, animals, plants, stones, mountains, seas, rivers, places, and even human artifacts, nature is recognized and experienced as a living and animate community, place of agency, relationality, and spirituality, and due care and respect. These notions and understandings challenge the dualities, such as immanent and transcendent, material, spiritual, body and soul, and of course, culture and nature. Thus, as a research field and analytical concept that researches relational, embodied, and material approaches, ideas, and representations, and of course, performative actions, in which humans engage with other natural elements, animals, and things, new animism contains an immense potential for generating wider discussions in the study of ancient and contemporary religions. New animism converges in several ways with the research field of material religion. This so-called material turn that is also shaping and taking and gaining new ground in the studies of religion promotes the idea that religion can be better understood and defined through considering the metrics of relations between knowledge, experience, beliefs, practices, places, and things. Approaching the study of religions with a material perspective means asking how religion happens materially, which starts with the assumption that things, their use, their evaluation, their appeal are not something added to religion, but rather inextricable from it. Accordingly, religion is done and co-created, along with this word, by a complex and dynamic network of agents, be they bodies, rituals, places, objects, images, stones, rivers, trees, sounds, tasted, and also, of course, text, minds, beliefs, even spirits. Religion should thus be readdressed as an everyday, sensuous, and embodied practice that, as far as it concerns our workshop, encourages people to engage in different relations with the other than human community and the local environment. These theories and approaches in contemporary studies of religion and anthropology are promising and deemed to spark fertile discussions and researches also on ancient religious cultures, and to shed new light onto emic, hopefully as much as possible, notions of religion, sacredness, personhood, nature, and agency. So in this workshop, our speakers are all scholars of different disciplines: archaeology, anthropology, art, philology, studies of religion, and they're all experts of different geographical areas and historical periods. Together, we will discuss these intertwined threads in ancient religions of the Old and New World. In order to spark a conversation and exchange that wishes to be informal, very much enriching, that's my hope, my wish, about ancient religions and among scholars, dealing with the Europe, ancient Europe and Mediterranean with ancient Near East. With Asia, we have two papers about one of Siberia, one of India. With about Africa, Ghana, and North America, as in the case for Alaska. We are aware that this is not exhaustive, but what I hope is that it will be just a starting point for future dialogues and researches into an increasingly relevant field. Of course, as Nicola also said, these threads will be further investigated and explored and are open to more people, more scholars to join in the reader contribution for the second volume of Maria, Material Religion in Antiquity, that will be published by Oxford. So I'll leave the stage now to Professor Graham Harvey. That is our first keynote speaker. And he's professor of the Open University, of Religious Studies at the Open University, UK. And he will be speaking and talking to us, with us, about sacred nature, animism, before nature, perspectives from new animist world making. I leave the floor to you, Graham, and thank you, everybody.
Almost forgot to unmute there. Thank you very much for your welcome. And let me share my
Are you
screen.
able to do so?
No, it says you've disabled it, so.
Okay, now you should.
Okay.
So is it working? Great.
So that, yes, good. Okay, let's. Okay, so once again, so my title, Before Nature, Perspectives, New Animist World Making. This is the most important slide. Thank you very much for the invitation, both to the whole CAMNES team and to those of you listening. I look forward to conversations both today and as they develop in the future. It looks like an exciting program in which I know I'm going to learn lots of things about the ancient world, the contemporary world, and these debates in different disciplines. So thanks very much for putting this on. Love the introductions. They clearly raise all these wonderful interdisciplinary, cutting-edge issues of the material turn, sensual turn, and point towards new debates about animism in multiple disciplines. So it's a very exciting time to be doing this kind of thing. So I also want to extend my thanks and acknowledge the authority of the people among whom I've learnt about what it means to live as an animist among the larger than human world. So these people might not call themselves animists, they might even object to the term. Hopefully after we've talked about what it might mean, they might object less, they might even celebrate it. I'm not going to introduce all of these people, but they're largely indigenous communities, indigenous individuals from Newfoundland, from what's now Wisconsin, from the Yoruba territories in Nigeria, a Mayan theatre group, some Cuban Orisha dancers, Maori diaspora community in Britain, an Aboriginal culture teacher in what's now Alice Springs, and a new animist ritual group in Britain. So these are just some of the people who I've engaged with and have shown me various aspects of what I'm happy to call animism, at least, and what's inspired me to think more about the implications for various aspects of our human lives and our relations with our larger than human community, our kin beyond the narrow realm of allegedly cultural humans. So I acknowledge those people, and what I want to do today is to propose an experiment, which I think is really what this whole conference is about, which is exploring what Isabel Stengers calls manners of living and cooperating, that brings together contemporary animistic lives and practices, cosmologies, ontologies, and so on, with what we know from the ancient world, and try to see if we can break open the things that the modern world, modern ideology, has made us take to be natural, authoritative, and so on. And maybe we find, but not only a richer understanding of the contemporary world, but we might also read and understand the ancient world differently, I mean, hopefully better. So on my slides, I just want to position where I'm at between still thinking through some experiences I had at the Con River of Miabukek Reserve in Newfoundland, Canada, and thinking about how those experiences and encounters with an Indigenous community and with eagles and other persons in this world, how that inspires me to try and rethink, without any great expertise, some facets of the ancient world. So I live, if I move my camera, I could show you the Stane Gate, which was the Roman invasion road when they were planning to move into what's now Scotland. But I also live about 3-4 miles from the Mithras shrine, Mithraeum, at Carabra on the Roman wall, or Hadrian's Wall. So that's what that other picture is of, the excavated Mithraeum there. So I kind of want to bring those two worlds together and see, possibly there are commonalities, but there might also be differences. There may be something radically different between what a Mithras devotee understood the world to be. They may possibly have understood the world, like Descartes, to be a separated between nature and culture, between humans and a less interesting material world. Somehow I doubt it. Somehow I think that maybe there's more commonality among contemporary, other than modern cultures and communities, and those of the pre-modern historical European traditions. So this is something of an experiment in breaking, crossing those walls, again, the Roman wall, and escaping from the boxes in which we put things. We separate the elements of the world, both, as we've already said, nature and culture, but also our disciplines tend to separate history, religion, the classics, and other literatures. And we develop expertise in different domains, as if the world were somehow divided into boxed items or walled off, which clearly it isn't. And so I like this phrase, sacred nature, as a provocative phrase, although I have some folk involved in this conference today know I've objected strongly to the word nature for some time and think that we should abandon it because it just reinforces some understanding of a separated realm, separate from humans and so on. Nonetheless, bringing this phrase together, sacred nature, provokes us to think that that nature and culture, after all, sacrality is made by cultural humans. So that suggests that there are cultures among those beings that we call nature that might break open some of these boxes and break down some of these walls. So what I'm proposing is that rather than the modern ideology, epistemology of a separated humanity, a human separatist movement, in which we think of nature as being inanimate, inert, a mere resource for humans to make use of, except when we occasionally encounter beings like whales or chimpanzees that we for some reason think are almost as intelligent as us. I won't go there. But going somewhere else also involves me in thinking that as a scholar of religion, we have tended to export a Protestant Christian European understanding of religion, briefly phrased as belief in God. We've exported that elsewhere, and we've tried to find something like belief in God in other communities. I mean, this isn't only Protestant Christian, there are other versions of Christianity clearly that did that, Columbus and company. But nonetheless, there are particular inflections of that North European understanding of religion that have been exported, so that in the 19th century, people invented the Young Men's Buddhist Association and created a creedal statement for Buddhists, somewhat like the Christian creed. So this notion has spread, and religion often gets defined with that inflection. So I proposed in the book, in that slide and elsewhere, that we should start elsewhere and maybe think about understandings of what might be called religion that arise in particular indigenous communities and elsewhere, and bring them back and rethink what the European traditions, both Christian and pre-Christian, might look like if we did start somewhere else, where maybe ritual is more important than belief. Maybe, well, I'm going to explore some of those, so let me not give you a long list now. So yeah, starting again elsewhere. So I want to do that in a sense of looking at world making and think about religion as one aspect of the way the world is made. So I put on the slide here pictures of the house martins currently building nests above my window under the eaves. They too are making the world more like the home that they want it to be, making it more suitable for them and their descendants. They're following traditions established by their ancestors who migrate around the world and so on. So world making isn't only human, but it might be one way of understanding what religions get up to. And this is often quite explicit among indigenous communities. So I want to think about how some of those indigenous traditions, those that I and others are calling animistic or animism, might make the world. So Anna has already very kindly cited my shorthand brief version of what animism might be. So I've said animists are people who recognize that the world is full of humans, wrong word entirely. The world is full of persons, only some of whom are human, and that life has always lived in relationship with others. So almost everything in that phrase needs lengthy discussion, has been challenged, has caused problems, and I've endlessly had to explain why I use the word persons rather than some other language. Linda Hogan, a wonderful Native American author, novelist, essayist, when I invited her to join in a conference about animism, she said, I don't know why you need this word. We just call it tradition. It's just the way the world is. It's all about relationships. So I don't think I've yet persuaded her that animism is a useful way to initiate a conversation around things that aren't so evident in European languages. Nonetheless, She contributed significantly to understanding how animism, or tradition in her sense, operates as the kinship between multi-species communities in particular places, not always pleasantly, and certainly not romantically, often with difficulties. So one of the reasons I use the word persons is because of the classic article, 1960 article by Irving Hallowell, in which he repeats, summarizes a conversation between himself and an elder who at that point he didn't name, but who was Kiewicz, or Alec Keeper. So Hallowell asked Kiewicz, are all the rocks we see around us here alive? And this elder paused and then said, wonderfully enigmatically, no, but some are. The point being that grammatically, rocks, stones in Ojibwe Moan, in Ojibwe language, are grammatically marked as animate. And so the conversation, Hallowell tried to understand what that might mean. And Kiewicz and other Anishinaabe speakers went on to explain in stories and demonstrations that it's really the wrong question. It's not about categories like life or death, or even animacy, inanimacy, or about agency or inagency. And it's about relationality. It's about relationships between different beings, different existences in the world. So the question should be, how do we appropriately engage in relationships across species boundaries with those who we encounter as we move through the world? And what tested experiences are handed on from one generation to another that encourage people to continue to seek respectful ways of being and moving through this world of kinship. So because Irving Hallowell, in trying to translate these discourses for his more philosophical American friends, because he used the phrase other than human persons, and unpacks that phrase to demonstrate that there are persons, potentially all existences that we encounter, and then there are human persons, bear persons, eagle persons, rock persons. And if we were to speak Anishinaabe and many other indigenous languages, we wouldn't need to say bear persons or eagle persons or even human persons. We would understand that the word bear or human or rock already means some of those things that the philosophical term person implies. And those things that it implies vary from the ability to communicate, the ability to choose, the ability to desire something, and in an Anishinaabe culture in particular, the ability to give and receive gifts, and to share wisdom with others who are willing to spend time and find the correct etiquette for that engagement. So none of these things are simple. All of them are worthy of further explanation. But that's why I've used this word persons, and it's caused some difficulty because of its implications in English and other European languages. Nonetheless, it's a rich term that's been used within new animism debates. I want to set out a few slides to just introduce some of the other contributions to that debate. So Narit David, an anthropologist who's learnt from the Nayaka communities in the Nilgiri Hills in India, and the human and larger than human community there, is insistent that when we write about the animistic relations between humans and others, that we need to pay attention to the immediacy of these relations. So animists are not broadly speaking, people have a theory that all the world is alive or everything you meet is an agent. They are people who have relations and want to improve relations or avoid relations, in some cases, with beings who they actually encounter. So for the Nayaka in India, elephants are often significant beings, but elephants often just do their own thing, communicate with each other, and maybe with other species. They don't always pay a lot of attention to humans, but occasionally they do. And when they do, the Nayaka have a word that can be translated something like the word persons. So elephants aren't always, in this sense, always engaged across that species boundaries. They're not always interested in us, but when they are, they might be called Devaro or something like persons. So immediacy is important. Kinship isn't exactly theoretical. It's about engagement and so on. This is not too far away from what Tim Ingold has insisted, that we should not think about animism as imputing or imparting life to things, but trying to understand how things move through life. Things in this case not only being material objects or made objects, but also humans and other material existences. And things is a nice word in this case because in Anglo-Saxon and other Germanic languages, thing also has the meaning of an assembly, a parliament, a coming together, an aggregation of beings. So the Icelandic parliament and other such groups are things. So thinging is an interesting way of thinking about the coming together of all those who share interests in the world being a better place for all of us. Robin Wall Kimmerer is a Potawatomi Native American botanist whose work I strongly encourage you to follow through. She's her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, also has a wonderful chapter on learning to speak as an animist, learning her own ancestral language, which has these grammatical distinctions. It's very closely related to Anishinaabe. So there are no masculine, feminine pronouns. Verbs and nouns are not marked as masculine or feminine, but they are marked grammatically as animate or inanimate. So in a recent article, she's a recent blog, she's argued that we should drop the pronoun it and try to, because it is an inanimate noun that suggests inanimacy, dead nature in Cartesian terms, and we should try and think of new pronouns. So she proposes ki and kin as singular and plural, as a animate pronoun to be applied across species boundaries. Others have proposed the pronoun per, perhaps abbreviation of person, to be used as a pronoun that doesn't privilege masculine, feminine, genital identities. So there are various ways of doing this. None of them yet has caught on entirely, but they're all exciting. I also, just on that slide, pointed you to Robin Wall Kimmerer's wonderful suggestion that we should think about contagious gratitude. So let me thank you again for being here with me. Moving swiftly on, because time is passing. A Maori scholar, Te Pakaka Tawhai, wrote what to me is the best, most exciting, provocative understanding of what religion might mean, the word religion might mean. And this is where, again, I take you elsewhere and invite you to bring it back to the religions that you know something about. So rather than looking at religion as belief in God or belief in deities or spirits or whatever, as some of us have done, let's think about whether Tafai's definition of the purpose of religious activity among my people, he said, is doing violence with impunity. So I've put a slide there of the way in which sweet potatoes, kumara, are grown in traditional fields in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And the reason for that is that Tafai illustrates this point by mentioning the sweet potatoes. And there's an intimate act of violence done when somebody has tended and grown sweet potatoes who would not have existed in that land had they not migrated in the same canoes with Maori around 1,000 years ago or slightly more. So just as others have asked whether, when we think of humans migrating out of Africa, actually it was the grasslands that wanted to migrate and just persuaded the humans to go and remove some of the trees so that the grasses could grow better. And we had this treaty relationship with the various forms of grass. So similarly, provocatively, maybe it was the Kumara who wanted to live in a new place and persuaded the Maori to build canoes to get them there. So there's this intimate relationship as the Maori arrived and as they learnt food resources in that new land, they relied on the sweet potatoes to keep them healthy. So when you dig up the sweet potatoes, you are doing violence. So how do you do that without suffering the penalties that most cultures insist are there for those who attack other beings? Religion, Tafai says, is what we do, which is there are rituals of apology, expressing gratitude, requesting permission, and so on. So, okay. So that's a thing I have attempted, experimented with, bringing back from elsewhere to rethink other than Maori religious traditions. Similarly, then I want to think about the phrase that Gary Snyder, a beat poet from the Sierras in California, tried to summarize how we might persuade the larger than human world or beings within it to aid us in our attempt to think differently into the world. What do other beings get from our relationships? How do we persuade them to carry on giving us their skins for our clothes, their wool for our clothes, their meat for our eating, their leaves for our nutrition and our health, and so on? And he came up with this wonderful phrase: performance is currency in the deep world's gift economy. That deserves far more time than I have today. So I just invite you to think about that one, and we'll come back to it sometime in a future conversation. So the performance is currency in the deep world's gift economy, the deep world being that animist, larger than human community. Challengingly similarly, in David Kapanawa and Bruce Albert's book, largely a autobiography of David Kapanawa Yanomami, David Kapanawa says that white people can't be shamans. So within the broader frame of animism, because of the nature of relationships across species boundaries, sometimes diplomats are needed to go and apologize to those who in the larger world that have been insulted by human behaviors. Diplomats are needed to go and request that those beings continue to feed us, their relations. So those diplomats are, in many languages, now called shamans or words, similar words. That word's been exported from Siberia to many other parts of the world, and is a useful translation for many other indigenous words. So David Kapanawa says white people can't be shamans, and his brief explanation for that is that when white people try to be shamans, what they do is dream about themselves. They're busy trying to heal their individual selves and work better as individuals within a world that wants us to be consumers and individuals in multiple ways, in political venues and commercial venues and so on. And David Kapanawa says that's not how shamanism works in the Amazon or in Central and Northern Asia and elsewhere. For there, it's about relations in this larger world. So just to reinforce that then, these are various recent anthropologists who've explored that same domain of how do we think about ourselves as individuals or dividuals, beings who are intimately related, whose relationships are multiple, divided, partitioned to some degree. We're not always lecturers or husbands and wives or children or shoppers. So our individuality comes into play very often. And in that attempt to understand our place in the world, we also need to think about our kinship in the larger community. So here, coming towards the end of what I want to say today, these slides are not nature. So they could be understood to be, to some degree, to a larger or smaller extent, the natural world. But in my understanding, having learned among these animistic communities, none of them are. All of them are about relations with others. But even if I wasn't trying to convey some sense of animism to you now, I still think that you could recognize that in all of these pictures, not only the one which is my front garden, and the Stane Gate just beyond the garden gate, that's the old Roman road. But the bottom left picture there is the stream that flows out of a spring, which 2,000 years ago was Coventine as well, a local goddess next door to the Mithraeum, up at Carabra next to the Roman wall. And that piece of land is now, and always has been for a long time at least, a place of engagement between humans and other than human persons. Sheep in a field clearly is part of the culturing of the world to make it more suitable for human consumption and so on. But even the wilder bit on the edge there, the river that flows by, that flows into the River Tyne, just near where I am now, that too is part of shaped by human action as well as by the actions of the trees and the rocks, the herons and the other beings who live in that part of the world. And finally, at the top right-hand picture, that's a picture of a fjord in Arctic Norway, in Sapmi, Sami territory, which is next to the home of a Sami poet who's been very important in the revival of yoiking. And so yoiking is a way in which Sami convey their respect to other persons, other beings in the world, human, other than human, fjords, mountains, and so on. So yoiking is a chant that becomes a gift to the being that you express your respect towards. So these I want to suggest ways of thinking about what we today may be calling the sacred world, sacred nature, but but I'm reluctant to use the word nature. And I want to think about it being ways of thinking about this larger than human community in which all beings together in particular places shape communities. Now, I happily know that I'm not alone in trying to think about animism in relation to the ancient and contemporary world. So here are three fine books, fine ways of exploring what I, if not they, might call animism. I know EJ is less interested in calling it animism, but Anna's book about Mesopotamia, Mari's book about the Hebrew Bible, and EJ's book about Rome and Italy, all of whom explore these new material and new, to me, animistic ways of understanding how those ancient religions might have understood the world differently to the modern construction, modern with a capital M in Bruno Latour's sense, a modern world in which humans are somehow unique and separate from that larger community. So it's possible, and I think that these people, these books have demonstrated the value of rethinking how materials, both quote natural and quote unnatural, might be understood, might have been understood very differently in those worlds. And this is almost my final slide, which is just to say, for the classicists there, I've been trying to think about how, again, going elsewhere and coming back, how the Maori word tapu, or in other Polynesian dialects, taboo, and the Hebrew word kadosh might help us to rethink what Latin and Latin-derived words like sacred or Germanic words like holy might mean. Because very often in modern discussions about religions, those words are often, again, back in those boxes. The sacred is separated out. So Rid of Otto's sacred is absolutely separate from the very ordinary material world of physical bodies, messy bodies. So tapu isn't like that. Tapu is a dynamic engagement which is always negotiable. So there may be things which are separate, but they're only separate until they are brought together. So that river flowing from the mountain, one of the mountains in the centre of North Island, Aotearoa, New Zealand, is tapu, not to be touched until tapu is removed, until sacredness is separated out, and the relationship can then be explored, opened up, and people can then get into the river, can drink from the river, but only when they've given respect and allowed that the river flows and the river has the right for other beings to share. Similarly then, kadosh, translated often as holy or sacred in Hebrew, can often be translated in a very fixed kind of way, as if sacred things are absolutely separated. So here, for those of you that read Hebrew, you might already be giggling. This is a wonderful bit of graffiti on a disused synagogue, now demolished, outside the Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem, which reads Makom Kadosh Asur Lehishtim Po, which means holy place. It is forbidden to piss here. Now, intriguingly, only in Hebrew, as if nobody else would even dream of pissing in a bricked up doorway. But there's something there about sacrality or holiness, and how it might or might not allow physical bodily actions to cross those spaces, to engage a space. So there's a dynamic interaction between, and again, clearly in Latin too, the sacred and the profane, the outside and the inside of a temple, literally, but how those dynamics are negotiated. So yeah, so this really is my slide in which I just say thank you very much for listening. And I look forward to conversations, provocations, contests around any of these things that I've said, and I hope that we can all go elsewhere together. Thank you for listening. Let me now stop sharing.
Graham.
If I can get my machine to come back to.
Yeah, wonderful.
There we are. Thank you very much.
See a lot of success. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Of course, I will have a lot of questions, but I keep them for later. So yeah, now if it's fine by you all because of this change in the lecture, in the program, I would like to invite on the stage Laura Feld. Hi, a bit early. I'm sorry for this.
That's fine.
Yeah. So if you'd like to start with your lecture, of course, I introduce you. Laura Feld is are you associate professor, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Sorry for this. Of the University of Southern Denmark, and she will be continuing the kind of discussion about animism and especially about personhood and wilderness in the Babylonian Sumerian stories of Lugalbanda and Gilgamesh. So please, Laura, we are all ears. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, and thank you also everyone, or not Anna, and your collaborators for inviting me to this exciting conference. What I would like to speak about today is a set of old Babylonian stories that involve non-human or more than human bird and tree-related persons, and their spatial setting in the mountain, forest, wilderness space, a space not controlled by humans, and their stories about how the human heroes Lugalbanda and Gilgamesh travel there, and they're dated to the 19th or 18th century before the Common Era. So very old stories, epic stories, epic literature. And I take inspiration here from the whole brand of criticism of the concept of nature in the study of religion and anthropology that Graham also talked about. And I work from an approach that combines a spatial and a narratological or narrative approach. And I would like to take a closer look today at the non-human characters of Anzu and Huwawa. So basically, I'm interested in both the spatial setting of these non-human bird and forest-related persons, but also in these characters as persons, because I believe that's one thing that can indeed be argued about these epics, is that they present Anzu and Huwawa as persons. And I think this supports an argument that we shouldn't understand neither the wilderness spaces of these texts in a dichotomous way, nor these non-human persons. So, right, let me get started. So here are some of the thinkers that I'm also inspired about, and Graham, you'll notice that you also feature in the corner. So there are so many interesting things going on today in the study of religion and anthropology, and so many ways that the concept of nature is criticized, and I would agree with Graham that it's a very problematic concept. There are so many developments today that show that humans and more than human areas and spaces and persons are fundamentally entangled. And this makes it very difficult to uphold dichotomous perspectives like the modernist distinction between nature versus culture that has in the past been applied also to the ancient world, to ancient religions. And in so many ways, the world around us today shows us that this sharp distinction, this dichotomy cannot be upheld, and that is also not very useful for ancient religions. So some of the people you see here are, of course, Graham Harvey and Philippe Descola, Timothy Morton, Tim Ingold, my Danish colleague, Morten Axel Pedersen, Rosi Bredati, and of course, Donna Haraway with her dog. And so her concept of nature cultures is in some ways useful, I think, for also thinking about, or at least messing with the more than human world. Because what we see in these stories, also from ancient Mesopotamia, is that you cannot separate nature out as a domain out there. So what we can talk about is varieties of nature cultures or more than human environments, and it certainly shows that we need to think about relations between human persons and the larger world in a relational way, I think. So my interest in this area comes from a project that I've been working on for some years. The little red book that you see on the slide is a sort of comparative wilderness mythologies book that I was also honored by Graham's participation in the project on wilderness in mythology and religion. But I've been in the meantime also working on a larger book project on ancient wilderness mythologies. So I've been interested now for some years in the wilderness, and it's important for me to say that I don't approach it in a dichotomous way, but I think about it as a complex nature cultural sort of cluster of relations that really requires a non-dichotomous approach. And it's something that we can find across several ancient religions, this area beyond the human space of habitation where you find a domain that's not controlled by humans, that you can travel to, that is primarily populated by more than human persons, life forms, objects, and with which relations have to be negotiated. So these are some of the things that I've looked at in the past, but also from a spatial and narrativity perspective, trying to dig deeper into how these wild domains and the wild persons that inhabit them, how are they understood? Resting on an approach that sees narratives as fundamentally world-making. So to get a bit more into this approach, I take some inspiration from critical spatiality theory, but I'm not adopting all of it, and certainly not some of its ramifications. But I do think there is some fertility in thinking about a space as something that is not just about positions on a map, but also about practices and ways of doing things and experiences. So it's very much also about spatial practice and spatial experience. And for that, I think we can usefully distinguish between material space, which is the concrete materiality of space, any sort of geophysical, empirical, non-human realities, objects, etc., connected to specific spaces. And then design space, which is a level of analysis that looks at normative understandings of space, authoritative formations and valuations of space that are drawn upon in narratives. And then finally, lived space, which is the experience of space, the moods and ways of being in space, space as lived and practiced. And this kind of research trends also overlaps in several ways with the materiality and ontology research trends. By being interested in exactly experience and senses and materiality. And this, of course, in relation to ancient Mesopotamia, has to be studied in relation to texts and narratives in my case. And here I combine this with some perspectives from narrativity studies, narratology, and cultural analysis, where we use narratological concepts, but for the purpose of analysis of epics such as these, for understanding religions better. And one basic distinction most narratologists make is, of course, between the basic structure, the skeletal or formal analysis of the structure of the story, the logical sequence of events. But most narratologists also distinguish that from the plot or the story layer, where this sequence of events can be played out in many different ways, where you can tell a story backwards, or you can focus on specific events in the structure and unfold them more. And I think this becomes very important with regard to my stories, because in these stories, which are basically, they follow in terms of structure, what we may call the combat fabula, or the combat structure, where a hero goes into the wilderness, interacts with some opponent or monster, and then returns to the home region again. And the structure has been interpreted as a structure of domination. But I would argue that if we look at the story layer or the plot layer, we can see how it's a completely different ideology or message that's unfolded, that is much more about relationality if we look at it in a more complex narratological way. So the final layer that I've highlighted in yellow here is the text layer, which stems from the narratology of Mieke Baal, a Dutch cultural analyst or narratologist, which is the sort of a term that takes into account the materiality of the text. Is it a tablet? Is it a papyrus? Is it a modern movie? Or what is the actual sort of materiality of the text and the narrative layers? So I want to look at spaces, but also characters. To sum it up briefly, I'm interested in these other than human characters as persons in a wild environment. And the epics that I look at are these epics of Lugalbanda and Gilgamesh from the Old Babylonian period. These texts are written in Sumerian, and they are high literary culture. They are seminal stories in their cultural context. They are culturally authoritative. They are literary. They are written by experts and academics who valued creativity and intellectuality. There are many puns and wordplays in them, things like that. They have cultural authority in scribal culture in this era. The words they use in Sumerian for these mountainous areas are Kur and Hosham, which designate a single mountain or a mountain range. Basically, there's also some words for forests involved. But basically, we are in a situation where we have the floodplains in terms of material space. If we want to talk about material space, the fertile floodplains where the cities are located, and then we have the mountain ranges to the east and northwest, where all kinds of materials needed to be procured from, mostly or most importantly wood, for prestige building projects of the elite. And then we also have a lot of trade going through these regions, of course. But basically, in the floodplains, trees or wood was not an available resource. There's been quite some previous research in the mountain wilderness, which has focused on it as a negative and inimical space, as a dangerous, chaotic zone, and has argued that the domination and destruction of this space was endorsed in Mesopotamian sources. And one of my key arguments also in previous work, but also today, would be that the standard view is really inadequate. And this whole nature-culture distinction that it also draws on this previous research is not fruitful for the Mesopotamian sources. And I think instead that what these wild spaces bring out is, or these texts bring out, is that the wild spaces are abundant and fertile spaces that are awe-inspiring and not dominated by humans, and also that respectful relations with these other than human persons are also cultivated in these texts. And I want to try to give you just a few examples of that, or indications of that. What comes out in these stories is that if we first look at briefly the facula, the basic skeletal structure of these stories, even these stories of Lugalbanda and Gilgamesh can be aligned to the combat fabula of the hero going into the wilderness, coming back victorious. Even if it is so, it doesn't mean that this is then the sort of relations with the wild space or the wild persons that is then endorsed. Because if we look closely at how this structure is treated in the story or plot layer, we get out a lot more complexity. So, for instance, in the Lugalbanda stories, out of the 916 lines, it is it's actually 714 of those lines are actually about or set in the mountains and involve interactions and relations with the mountain wilderness and with these non-human persons. And some of the same goes for the stories of Gilgamesh and Huawa, where we have, I think, around 220 lines, and 140 of those are actually about interacting with Huawa and with the forest wilderness. So we have a very specific focus in the stories or plot layers of the narratives that sort of complicate this classical reading of the combat fabula. So, and which sort of has perhaps been part of the reason why scholarship has overlooked these benign portrayals and positive portrayals of the wilderness and the monstrous opponents. Right. So if we look at the Lugalbanda stories, we have a situation where Lugalbanda he goes in a way on an entertaining adventure into the mountains with his friends and a large army of the king, because they're part of a set of poems about the legendary Sumerian king of Enmerkar, of Uruk, and his rivalry with another city, Arata, about which city was the favorite of the goddess Inanna. And between these two cities, we have this big mountain wilderness. And as they are traveling towards this other city, Lugalbanda falls ill, and his mates have to leave him in a cave in the mountains. And so he's left all alone with some food for some days, and they abandon him there, and they think he will probably die. But he doesn't die, and he gets the help of Utu, for want of a better word, let's say the sun god. And then as he tries to make his way back to his friends, he meets this more than human person, other than human person, the bird person, Antu. Antu is in this story, we could say he's ambiguous in some ways, but he's certainly also much more benign and friendly, more than human person than we would expect from reading some of the previous research. So, and there's a lot of story attention focused on on this monster bird. He is monstrous in some ways. He has shark's teeth and an eagle's claws, but he certainly has personhood and family relations. And he is wild and unpredictable in some ways, but I would say that the story cultivates the idea that respectful interaction is the way to interact with this bird person. And Ansu can also speak with Lugalbanda. So while Ansu is away, Lugalbanda decorates his nest and his chicks and etc. So as you can see here in this quote, when Ansu returns to his nest, it seems to him that it had been made like a god's dwelling place. It was brilliantly festooned. His chick was settled in its nest. Its eyes were painted with kohl. Sprigs of white cedar was fixed on its head. And the bird becomes very glad. And he says, I am the prince who decides the destiny of the rolling rivers, etc. And then he promises, whoever has done this to my nest, if you are a god, I will speak with you. I will befriend you. If you are a man, I will fix your fate. What I think this first epic that I want to show you is showing us is that not only that respectful interaction with this non-human person is actually cultivated by this narrative, but also that heroism, Lugalbanda's heroism, is not about brute force and violence and strength. It's about being creative and cunning and witty. Lugalbanda manages to survive in the wilderness and to also get a magical gift from Ansu. He refuses the two first gifts that Ansu suggests that he can get and asks instead of speed in running, something that we may see recurring in the story of Elijah in the Hebrew Bible. We can talk about that later if you want to. So there's not a hint of domination of the wilderness as a destruction of it as a desirable thing. Instead, it's about interacting with it respectfully. The next story is a set of stories, Sumerian stories of Gilgamesh and Huwawa, that I think also show that respectful communication and interaction with the forest person of Huwawa is also what is idealized and cultivated in the story. The greater part of this epic, or this set of stories, is also about how you interact with this forest monster, the guardian of the forest, Huwawa. Again, it's most of the lines of the story. It's about 200 lines long, and 140 of them is actually about the forest and about Huwawa. He protects the cedar forest. And the basic point and communicated in the text, I think, is that the success of the heroes, Gilgamesh and Enkidu, in acquiring the wood that they have come there to get, is contingent on their interaction with Huwawa. And the narrative emphasizes that the relation should not be one of domination and destruction. The forest wilderness is sanctioned by the deities. It's under the special protection of Utu. And we see also in Huwawa's appeal to Utu after Gilgamesh has tricked him, that this forest person is someone worthy of sympathy. As you can see at the bottom of this slide, Huwawa says, Utu, I never knew a mother who bore me, nor a father who brought me up. I was born in the mountains. Yet Gilgamesh swore to me by heaven, by earth, and by the mountains. So Gilgamesh has here tricked him. And this is not condoned. The heroes have acted wrongfully. They should have let Huwawa dine with them. They should have let him drink with them. They should have treated him with more respect than they did. So, in a sense, the story has the structure of the heroic fabula of the victory of a dangerous monster in the mountains, but it shows that this is not respectful way of interacting with the mountain forest and with this non-human person. Instead, respectful relations should have been negotiated. And the hero's victory is not framed in the terms of a combat, but it's a witty dialogue instead. So I think this can also speak of scribal ideals and scribal ideals of leadership in terms of wit and cunning and etc. instead of brute force. So both of these texts likely reflect a lived space of scribal culture. In any case, I think we can certainly say that the monstrous more than human wild persons function in both stories as functional characters, as agents and subjects in their own right. They evoke sympathy and compassion from the readers, and I think we can show this in the texts. So again, I think both stories show that a strict dichotomy, a modernist dichotomy between nature and culture doesn't work well in relation to this material. It's much more a question of a relational cosmos that you have to interact with in a respectful way. In the story of Huwawa, it also ends in the way where his magical luminous rays are distributed not only into in brackets a nature area, but also to various different places, both fields and rivers and reed beds and lions and the palace and the forests, etc. So you cannot really use very well, I think, a strict dichotomy between nature and culture. We also see how the Gilgamesh and Huawa text wants to keep his powers independent of the ruler, because they're not distributed to Gilgamesh at the end. Yes, so in both texts, I think we can see that the wilderness spaces and their non-human inhabitants are valuable and powerful, and they're not controlled by humans, but humans. The attitude is cultivated in both texts that you should have respectful relations with these persons and spaces, and sympathy for both wild spaces and wild persons is cultivated. That would be what I would try to argue. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. No, I was chatting. We were discussing a few questions. So wonderful, Laura. It's really interesting. And since we just decided with the organizers that perhaps we should introduce now a short Q&A, because otherwise we'll have 40 minutes of break. So if it's fine by you, I mean, you can manifest yourself. Please, we are welcome all to share your video, so I can also see we can also see some face reactions. If it's all fine, if it's fine by you, we would just now start with, I don't know, 10-15 minutes of the Q&A. I'm sorry that perhaps tomorrow this will not be possible, but we'll try to balance. So please, can I see you all? All speakers, great. I see Seth, I see, wonderful. Yeah, I think it was a time to see you. Well, I have a lot of questions, or just more discussion, but I'd like to open up to the others first. So I see Seth and Helison Thomason and Nicola. Okay, so let's start with you three, please. And of course, if anybody wants, there's a chat to write any question. If somebody is shyer or doesn't want to talk, whatever. So please, Seth, you were the first one.
Oh, was I? Okay. Well,
And I saw.
thank you both for both those talks. Laura, I had a very general question, I think, without a particular answer in mind. I'm just wondering what your thinking is about this, but in the same Sumerian literature, of course, there's a great deal of conflict with nature as well. I'm thinking of, Inanna and Ebi, where she goes and beats up a whole mountain. So I just and maybe that's a case where only gods could do that. It's not a conflict that's set up between people. Mm-hmm. But I'm just wondering how your analysis rests with some of that conflict as well.
Thank you very much for this question. What I think is really interesting about Inanna and Ebi is that, yes, absolutely, Inanna goes and smashes Ebi, but we also have embedded in the same story some wonderful descriptions of the beauty of the mountain and of Anne's speech, which totally complicates. So on the one hand, I would agree with you that it's different when it's gods doing it. But on the other hand, I would also highlight how there are some character speeches in that text that complicate this view of destruction and smashing the mountains, and some really beautiful descriptions of the mountain, really, and that sort of value it and highlight, the deer's mating and yeah. Anna, you know this text very well as also. So,
okay.
So I think it's not only in that text either. It's not only about destruction.
May I also intrude, because I feel called to intrude in this, because of course those texts that you were presented as, I also work at them. I mean, and exactly those were the passages that I also especially used. I mean, that struck me, when I was reading the text. I mean, they were calling me to be analyzed in a different way, I would say, or just explored in a different way. And of course, I think that, but I don't want to perpetuate this dichotomy, between dominance and ecology, but it seems that there are at least two different approaches to the forest, at least, that of course are negotiated and vary. And so that's something that we should perhaps discuss more. And I'm sure that where is Joelle Caesar, who has also other ideas about the Gilgamesh forest? I think that was here. Yeah, absolutely. And also the Anzu, for example, it was fantastic. And now it's a bit of a daring comparison that I will be doing, but by reading also some Native American, North American mythology, you have striking examples of stories in the folk stories about also the Ojibwe that Graham mentioned, about the Thunderbird. And they also have a society, they also have a different, protocols and communication between humans. So something, yeah, to be thrown on the stove right now, I guess. So, yes, I think that was Helison or Nicola. Please decide who wants to start. Helison Thomason, please.
Yeah, hi, I'll go next. I have to say I was listening this morning, driving my car over a great river, the Mississippi. So it's amazing to be able to zoom into this conference. I have a question for Laura and for any other Mesopotamian commentators. I'm curious about how you see wild animals or non-monstrous animals and their relationship to the environment. It's something I've been looking at in terms of Neo-Assyrian images. And you can also get into glyptic as well, not just monumental. So just curious how you see that fitting into this complication, because I totally am seeing where you're going.
That's also super interesting question, and I've also been reading some of your work with great interest. So that's not something I've done a lot of work on, except to look at how metaphors for how the metaphor of the wild bull, for instance, is used of deities in Sumerian texts and things like that to signal, to sort of indicate strength and more than human power and sexuality and but yeah, I haven't. Maybe someone else wants to take this question up, but I haven't worked so much on wild animals, but I certainly see there's a lot of very interesting stuff to get into in this realm.
I can say a little bit about it from the Hebrew Bible perspective, which is not quite the same, but similar cultural area. And I think part of what's interesting is, so there are terms for wild animals, which is just animal of the field, as opposed to a domestic animal, but there's not a clear, as a category, there's not a clear difference between domestic animals and wild animals, in the sense that there's lots of wild animals that are regularly interacted with, like gazelles. So you can eat a gazelle, you can touch it, those kinds of things. But then there are wild animals that are understood as being much further from humans. So jackals, for example, move in when humans move out. And so, well, Graham Harvey talked about immediacy. And so I would say there's not the sense of like wild animals in general. It's these circles of immediacy. So some animals are like, they live in your house. And then there's some animals that you interact with regularly. And then there are some animals that are, whose living needs are so different than your own that habitation doesn't overlap. And so I think that's, though there is a term for wild animals, they are not thought of generally as like one clear group. That makes sense.
Yeah, this is also made confusing in the Neo-Assyrian context when you have, hunted, not hunted, but you have game parks where wild animals are sort of enclosed. So that dichotomy again falls apart. But we see images of, say, lions in both contexts in the relief. So it's something I'm looking into in further depth. So thank you.
Thank you, Alison. And perhaps either Nicola or even Seth could add something to this conversation. So
I don't know, I'm more into, there are some comments and questions in the chat that Joelle is like talking about wilderness.
Yeah.
I was just like, I had a question comment to Graham and also Laura. And I love the lion behind Alison when she was talking about lions. It's just like, it was very impressive. But I'm an old world water creature coming from a little small island called Sicily. And my wife is American. So once we went to the Redwood, and I went inside the Redwoods, and after 20 miles in that forest, I got frightened. And I told my wife, I'm sorry, I'm panicking. So one thing that I would like Graham and also Laura to kind of discuss with us is the relationship between fear, nature, and the creation of spirituality. Because I don't like the idea of that we need to disconnect because of this westernized approach. We have to disconnect the relationship between fear, spirits, and nature in creating forms of spirituality in connection with nature. What's your perspective on this, on the concept of fear? Because Laura talked about this fear in kind of an antagonistic way, but I think fear can be a pivotal movement towards the creation of the spirituality of nature. And so it's more like opening up a sort of discussion on what Graham talked about and what Laura also talked about.
Yeah, so I mean, maybe I can go first. So yeah, I just wonder whether fear sometimes might be a dramatic form of respect in which you recognize a boundary, which you realize you're the smaller being in a larger community, or you haven't yet found the right way to engage, there's all this stuff going on around you, all these other beings busy communicating, and you're the weird invading alien. So respect or fear might be awe, maybe another word for that, might be the appropriate response, that you're recognizing that this is not your home, and you haven't yet found the right way to request permission to be there. Maybe you've wandered. I mean, if you wandered 20 miles and you haven't yet made an offering of some kind, maybe that's why. Maybe other beings are kind of signaling that you're not yet welcome, and you want to go back to the beginning and do something. I mean, this, I'm just so. I mean, I think there are beings in the world who are not happy to be with humans, and we shouldn't romanticize all this relationality. I've said before that if you want to be respectful to a hungry lion, bowing down's not a good idea. There are other ways to do that, and actually being fearful might be entirely the right thing to do. So there are various forms, I think, of that. But I don't want to romanticize awe as this kind of Rudolf Otto version of, oh, I'm unworthy and so on, because sometimes awe can be, I see the incredible dark sky with this full of stars. I don't want to be hammered to the ground and feel unworthy. I want to dance or make an offering. That's part of actually the response by that whole performance is currency in the deep world's gift economy. What will you give to show that you're not the most powerful being here? So those are just some random thoughts about fear and awe in that context. But
I agree very much with what you're saying now, Graham. Also, both as anyone I think who spent time in a wilderness today, as Nicola also indicated, knows the importance of fear. But it's also very much present in our ancient texts, in the Sumerian text. It's the fear and awe and the vis-a-vis the sort of immensity of the other than human environment is very much present in the texts.
Yes, I take the word. Just I wish to give the word to Erica now. I mean, it's great. My brain is working with more ideas also about forest and seas. Personally, I'm from Venice. I should be more attached to the sea, but I find more, comfortable in the forests. And I think that also forest, if you are with the right people that know the forest. I mean, now I'm talking from a very personal, maybe ethnographical, I don't know, approach. Then also the fear disappears. It's like, because walking with a forest through a forest with a person, human in this case, that teaches you the way of the forest. And this brings me to the Epic of Gilgamesh with the description of the forest. You remember, Laura, that it said at the very beginning of this new fragment that was found, that I found very beautiful, that it is tidy. The forest is tidy. The paths are well kept. So it's a kind of different order from the urban one, from the plain. So, okay, but I should stop and I give the word to Erica and then to the next questions, and then I think we have a break.
Yeah, I'd like to play off some of the things that actually all of you have been saying, but I want to return to this idea of fear, which I suggest is actually perhaps a lack of knowledge of the proper etiquette. And this sort of relates to what Anna has just said about being with someone who is familiar with a specific kind of nature. At least where I work in Alaska, there are rules, there is etiquette for behavior, for going into areas that are not human areas. And so I would suggest that in Laura's example of Anzu, part of the reason that the relationship with Anzu went so well is that the etiquette was followed, that the hero behaved in a way that was appropriate for the situation. And instead of it being wilderness, it became a social relationship. It was socialized, but socialized in a way that was appropriate for Anzu, right? Because the etiquette for dealing with Anzu in the wilderness is going to be very different than in the city or in any other area. So I would suggest that the wilderness is actually just another society, but with different rules. And in order to interact productively and socially, you just need to understand the rules. And so getting back to Nicola, the Redwood Society has a different set of rules. And of course, you don't necessarily know what those are. And this can, of course, create fear in the same way that it might if I was dropped into a city in another continent that I was unfamiliar with. I would not know the rules either. So not wilderness perhaps, but society of different sort that to humans appears to be wilderness because we don't know the etiquette.
Thank you, Erica. You convinced me to go back to the Redwoods now.
But take a gift.
Okay, should I have two questions, one by Joelle that I will read and then by Seth. I go by chronological order. So Joelle Ziza asked a question to Laura, and he asked, is it possible to integrate not only the mountain core, but also the steppe into this concept of wilderness? In an article, wait, that I lost the piece, very long. Wait a second. Joelle, why don't you speak with us? In an article to be published shortly, I dealt with uprooting, cutting down and transportation of trees in the city of Kings. And nothing, it doesn't work with me, this chat, I'm so sorry.
I read it. These trees are to be understood as elements of a wider wilderness with which they share a powerful and ambiguous ontological otherness to the city. The king's action on the tree, like that of a farmer or a gardener, with the consequent realization of artifacts, allows, in my opinion, through a cultural organization of the power of the tree, the renewal of the relationship, always subject to crisis between the human community and the divine world. Sorry, my camera doesn't work, and other trees cut it is pullable. And then Seth to Graham. I have a large type question for Graham that I'm not entirely sure how to formulate, but I wonder how one discusses cases when more than one set of traditional beliefs come into conflict with each other somehow. Not so much as when, for example, modern Christianity comes into critical conflict with traditional ideas, but when two traditions have a conflictual, not say syncretic, accommodationist relationship, critical of one another. I'm not sure this is really answerable, but I do wonder about it. Then I think Laura responded to Joelle. So Laura to Joelle, I think you responded. If you want to add more, and then Graham to Seth.
Right. So I just wanted to say, your work sounds absolutely fascinating, and I'd love to read it. And what I've tried to do in my forthcoming book is exactly to present the concept of wilderness in the sense that it's comparative and can be used cross-culturally. So absolutely, idin or zero is also a form of wilderness, and that the wilderness can, as Erica also said, be a social domain. So yeah, briefly.
Thank you. Thank you. Now my camera works. So thank you very much for the reply. Yeah, sorry. There was, I think, a problem with my browser. So thank you very much. So the point is that there is, my opinion, a relation between trees and these other person, not human person, such as Hubaba, but at the same time with Inanna, with the Hulubu tree. No, in both stories, Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, cuts the tree and realize an object. In the case of the Hulubu tree, the Ekema and Elag, which we don't know what they are exactly, but of course they are related with the power. And in the other cases, with the cedar tree, Gilgamesh and Enkidu realized the door of the temple of Ekur in Nippur, so the temple of Enlil. So the transportation of the trees from this otherness, from this wilderness to the city, imply a renegotiation of the relationship between this otherness and the city. No, this is the point, in my opinion. And your articles and book about this topic were very inspiring me about this theme. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, so the question by Seth, which is, now I could read it. I don't know why my chat was stuck, but it's, Graham, can you tell us something about it? Because it's another main issue.
Yeah, I just begun to type a response as Laura had for the other question, but so it's a very good question, and I don't have a full answer, but just thinking through it now, I think again it would depend on which communities, which traditions are coming into conflict, and how they might, what might get generated by that. So I think in so if we were talking about the Lakota and the Anishinaabe in traditional time, 200 years ago, they'd have probably fought it out. They were traditional enemies. The Anishinaabe talk about pushing the Lakota out of the forest up onto the plains, sadly just in time for European invasion to have an even bigger effect on them. So there are conflicts, and there are many other examples of conflicts between cultures and traditions in which people don't think they're compatible, and others in which they're negotiated. So the Haudenosaunee Confederacy had these traditions of the peacemaker, in which conflict is resolved by ritual and story and sitting around fires and various negotiations. But my primary example, I think, of the more positive, but still negotiation between traditions might be among Maori communities. So let's take an extreme example. If a Maori dies in one place, it's traditional for them to be buried where their placenta was buried, back in their traditional family home. But if you're buried somewhere, if you've lived your life away from that community, you've had a family elsewhere and so on, those people want to bury you in this place where your new home has been, and clearly you can't be buried in two places. So what do? So one of the things that the Marae tradition, meeting place tradition, is about is these complex negotiations between people from different places. So they can be guest making, but when you make a guest, your guest doesn't have to agree, but they do have to be respectful of local tradition. So in the case of a death, and this is a genuine example, which is why I'm picking it without naming any names, what happens when somebody's died elsewhere than their family, their birthplace? Somebody has to negotiate an agreement, and if they can't, then maybe somebody takes the body and runs off with it to be buried back in the birthplace. So so the ideal is when you can negotiate an agreement between the two sides. And I've written about how that might be a good model for academic research, not appropriating from Maori or other traditions, but saying, okay, here's a way of saying you take steps into the other person's space, like the forest we just talked about. You find the way to breathe together, literally in Maori context. You press noses and you share the breath of life, the literal breath. You then eat together, and you're committing to being respectful of one another. But then you get inside the meeting house, who is an ancestor, and then you sit opposite each other and you explain why you're there together. You respect the local host community, but you might not find an absolutely perfect way of agreeing, which is the ideal, of course. So those are difficult examples of ways in which people might try this. And I think we could find lots of local examples of both a conflictual and a collaborative effort towards resolving that problem of traditional conflict between traditions in different places. And as you said, sorry, in the question, syncretism, accommodation might be one way of doing that. And all I want to add to that is that we shouldn't really need a word like syncretism, because that's the norm in meeting other people, is we learn from each other and we adapt and we learn and we adopt. Syncretism is only become a dominant word because, again, Protestant, well, European Christians in particular, of different kinds, have thought that the tradition should be fixed in its box and nothing should be added or subtracted from it or to it. So they need a word like syncretism, which is a bad word, a negative word, rather than saying, hey, why should I not learn from these other people? So it's kind of the oddness of thinking from elsewhere, where syncretism shouldn't be a necessary word at all. It should just be, hey, I've learned.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Right.
Great. That's fantastic. Sparking more and more questions and discussions, but I think that we're all a bit tired to sit in front of a computer. So let's have a coffee break, tea break. And so if, in order to restart for the second and final, let's say, part of this afternoon, we have 15 minutes of break. Please don't leave the YouTube, the Zoom talk, the Zoom platform. Just leave it as such, as mute and turn off the video. And we will meet at Italian 5:20. See you soon. Thank you. Hello.
Hi.
Okay, are you back?
Okay.
Very brief, too brief, probably. Coffee break, tea break. Okay, I don't know who's back. Just let's leave another 1 minute or two for everybody to come back to the computer. Here we are. Okay. So, hoping that everybody's here, I wish to introduce our next speaker, Professor Hester Jacobson Tepfer at the University of Oregon, who will be presenting us a lecture titled The Structures of Meaning in Rock Art of the Mongolian Altai, Science of Liminality. Please, Hester.
Okay, so now I have to just get onto this.
Yeah,
Okay,
you see, do you see share the screen?
Yeah, okay.
Yes, should be working.
Okay,
wonderful. And now you just do what you want with your computer, with your desktop.
Okay, does that work?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
Fantastic, perfect.
Thank you, Anna, and thank you, the rest of you who have organized this very interesting workshop. It's very interesting to me because most of the material that's been presented is from a very different part of the world than that which I have been involved in. So we've been asked to think about the ways which as the fabric of integrated relationships joining the human and non-human worlds, and how those relationships may reveal basic beliefs, even cosmologies, within pre-modern society. In responding to those guidelines, I wish to center my comments on the concept of liminality, that is, on the process of transition between forms of being and how it is expressed in one tradition of ancient rock art from a very remote time and place. The challenge is this: we have no contemporary documentation for this material, nor can we name those by whom it was executed. Our only resource is the pictorial material itself within its physical environment. As a result, I can point to meaningful patterns in these relationships and offer interpretations, but I cannot prove them. I ask you to consider this visual material as such and see where it takes us. The rock art I will be discussing is located in the Altai Mountains of northwestern Mongolia. This range divides Central from North Asia. It rises in South Siberia and extends southeast to end in Mongolia's Gobi Desert. Our study area is centered in the northern Altai, where present-day Mongolia abuts Russia's Altai and Tuvan republics and China's Xinjiang province. In the present, the landscape is dry mountain steppe, and the climate is extremely cold and windy throughout much of the year. In the Bronze Age, however, the mountains were more forested, and the valleys offered richer riparian zones. The animal world was consequently very different from today's. When we began working there, we could still see wolves and snow leopards, argali and ibex, and golden eagles, cinereous vultures, and lammergeier wheeled above us as we worked. Much of that wildlife has now disappeared. Mongolia's northern Altai includes the most extensive petroglyphic complexes in North Asia and the least damaged by modern impacts. Until recent decades, this material was virtually unknown, even though it constitutes a huge pictorial record of the hunters and then herders who moved into the mountainous region beginning in the late Pleistocene. My interest here is rock art dated to a period between the second millennium BCE. Most of the compositions I will consider are found within high glacier formed valleys in northwestern Bayan Ogi Aimak. So that's this region up here. These valleys were probably uninhabitable until the late Pleistocene. Today, herders move into the valleys in the summer months, but otherwise they are virtually uninhabited. The rock art panels of this region are pecked or engraved on boulders and outcrops. They are often covered with many figured compositions, including humans and animals, and hunting and household scenes, and scenes of caravanning and herding. Some of these panels mix imagery from many cultural and chronological periods. Others are more unified in subject and style and appear to be organized with a clear narrative purpose, but how to read that narrative is a puzzle. From when we first began our survey and documentation in this region in 1994, I noted its unusual naturalism and narrativity and assumed that what I saw was fairly straightforward, a hunt, for example, or a family caravanning to new pastures. With time, however, I was increasingly troubled by my inability to find a firm interpretative footing for much of this material. If it was as naturalistic as I assumed, why were there no signs of struggle or death? Why did the world in those petroglyphs seem so unruffled by the troubles people must have experienced within that harsh land? I increasingly realized that in order to decipher the material, at least three conditions were essential. First, I had to have at hand or in my mind's eye, a massive compendium of comparative material. Second, I had to consider how the natural environment may have shaped the meaning of the panels. And third, I had to look not only for like motifs, but also for the way in which those motifs are joined and how that particular joining creates meaning. In other words, I had to identify structures of meaning in the organization of motifs. The oldest images we recorded are within the complex of Archaeology. Most of the animals represented there belong to the late Pleistocene and early Holocene and are static individual elements. There are also a few birthing women. Their crude rendition, as you see here, the lack of any narrative context, and the worn character of the rock underscore their antiquity. These images may well be the earliest anthropomorphic references in Altai rock art. In the two larger valleys of Sagangol and Bago-Oigor, such isolated birthing figures are rare, but not absent. They are usually integrated into later scenes that appear to have deliberately used the more archaic images to add another level of meaning. For example, on a boulder where there had already been pecked two archaic birthing women, someone in the early Bronze Age overlaid a hunting scene, including an archer and a captive, as if to derive a degree of potency from the more archaic figures. And in another and later case, a birthing woman appears at the side of a hunting scene surrounded by wild animals. Neither she nor the hunter seems to be aware of each other. They exist on the same boulder, but isolated from each other within a wild landscape. One senses that her being is an absolute given on which his activity depends. On yet another boulder, a strange figure with horns is clearly represented in the act of birthing. There's a figure here, you can see it may be a little difficult, but there's a baby coming out. There are no hunters here, but the figure is approached as if in homage by wild animals. There are several images of this type in the Bago-Oigor complex, horned figures with small interior beings or approached by animals female in gender. Taken together, these compositions seem to reflect a hunter's belief that the animals on which he depended were given life by a female power, and that what he took from the mountain had to be renewed. The horned figures indicate that her essential being was liminal, located between human and animal. I believe that the hunting scenes with birthing women should be dated relatively early in the Bronze Age. In later hunting scenes, the birthing woman has been replaced by a figure standing quietly beside the hunt. In this version, the stag hunters seem unaware of the large woman on the left. And in another composition representing a hunt after Orc, a smaller, more youthful woman stands beside the hunter. On several panels with hunting scenes, we find images of what are euphemistically referred to as loving couples. In this example, hunters bracket the two magnificent red deer, while below can be seen a couple in embrace. Reading these various compositions is problematic. It is highly unlikely that women would appear in the middle of a hunting scene, nor does the juxtaposition of birthing women or copulating couples seem to make sense in the real world of the hunt. Rather, it seems that all these panels, with their variations on the motif of the female presence, reflect the structure of meaning within which the success of the hunt depended upon signs of regeneration. In these compositions, the narrative bridges two worlds, that of the hunter and that of the mistress of the mountain and her animals. What appears to be a scene taken from everyday life instead refers to the transitional character of human animal life, of its liminality. Another trope relevant to the discussion repeats itself across these rock art complexes. This one involves what looks like a fairly pedestrian narrative centered on a yak loaded with a family's worldly goods. The appearance of such an image actually reflects the practice of transhumance that emerged by the middle of the second millennium BCE, when herders began to move into high mountain pastures for the summer months. The massive yaks are frequently shown carrying the family's collapsed portable dwelling, known as a ger, or more familiarly, a yurt. As if that were not enough, their load is often topped with the children of the household, all with an old person. You can see two children right here and right here. Time and again, we find that the loaded yak motif was associated with a woman leading the caravan and with a hunting scene at the side. We can say that the loaded yak represents the family household and its well-being, while the animals and the motif of the hunt reaffirm the household's dependency on a wilder world. The composition is thus both a reflection of reality, an evocation of the integration of human and non-human worlds within the potent space of the mountain, and an indication of the centrality of the female to that balance. I have spoken of the yurt as a sign of a family's well-being. We know from ethnographic data that the yurt was centered by the threshold fire, traditionally tended by the mistress of the household and carried by her when the family moved camp. In addition to the yurt, however, we know for certain that during the winter months, Bronze Age herders lived in small, sturdy dwellings. We find the images of such dwellings in many Bronze Age petroglyphs, such as this one from Sagangu, where you see the entrance, a hearth, and room divisions. In fact, the combination of the two dwelling types, portable yurt and solid dwelling, has persisted to this day in the higher valleys of the Altai Mountains. However, both kinds of shelter, the yurt and solid dwelling, carried another symbolic load during the Bronze Age. Here, allow me to take a brief detour to speak of the archaeology of death in that period. Within the Altai-Sayan region, there are several types of mounds and stone settings that can be dated to the Bronze Age. These include simple stone mounds and elaborate mounds, usually set on high terraces over rivers. There have been few excavations of these mounds, but the assumption is that if they were burials, the bodies have long since disappeared. There is also a very beautiful kind of monument called a hirgisur. This takes the form of a central mound with surrounding frame and radii connecting the two. Where hirgisur have been excavated, sometimes there are burials and sometimes there are not. There is one kind of Bronze Age stone setting that is rather different and takes us back to dwellings. This setting traces out on the surface of the earth the design of a true dwelling, with entrances, insulated walls, interior divisions, and most importantly, a hearth. We find these settings by the dozens in certain valleys. And although some scholars have theorized that they are the remains of actual structures, that could not be the case. They are always found on terraces completely unprotected from the cold winds that sweep down from the mountains throughout the year. The few such settings that have been excavated have revealed burnt sacrificial materials, but nothing of burials. These facts have led me to believe that stone settings are virtual dwellings, laid out to commemorate a person's death and to project his or her dwelling into the next world. Thus, the image of the dwelling in rock art could be either a dwelling in this world or one intended for the next. So now let me go back to several compositions in the Bago Oigor Valley to see where this leads us. On a terrace in Bago Oigor 2, we found a huge boulder covered with images. The boulder looks out over the river and distant snow-crested mountains. Most of the south face of the boulder is covered with small animals and hunters, transforming the surface into a mountain landscape. At the top of the boulder on the right can be seen the outlines of a dwelling of the kind we have just been observing. If we read it as real, then we would conclude that it is part of a real landscape, the hunter's dwelling perhaps. But if we read it as virtual, then it qualifies the hunting scene, projecting it also into the next world. On the upper left is another section that qualifies the hunt still further. One seemingly 6 large elk are stretched out in profile, and beside them are 3 birthing figures, one seemingly touching a doe at her neck. These figures must be the incarnation of the mistress of the mountain, and with their animals, the elk, they represent the regeneration of game. But where does this happen? This composition seems to balance between 2 worlds, the land of the living and the land of the dead, the land of beginnings and its reflection in another realm. There's actually one other built element found in Bronze Age rock art. This is the image of a vehicle, but these vehicles are curious. They are 2-wheeled, but sometimes the wheels are spoked, indicating a light vehicle attending for speed, and sometimes the wheels are solid, indicating a heavier vehicle for carrying loads. The horses pulling both kinds of vehicles are sometimes static and sometimes represented as swift animals, as if pulling the vehicle at great speed. But in the high Altai valleys, these valleys are covered with boulders. It is impossible to imagine a wooden vehicle bouncing over this ground without rapidly falling apart. Many of the vehicles are driven by archers aiming at a wild animal without holding any reins. Or, stranger yet, there are no drivers, or no wheels, or no horses, or the figure in the basket appears to be dead. Taking a clue from burial practices in the mountainous regions of Mongolia over the last few hundred years, and from the striking scarcity of actual burials associated with Bronze Age surface monuments, I have concluded that the wheeled vehicle was indeed a means of transportation, but it functioned primarily as a sign of death and of the transportation of a deceased person's body into the mountains for a sky burial. In other words, in rock art, it was a virtual chariot, and like the virtual dwelling, referred to the land of the dead. On a high outcrop in Bagoigor 3 are several remarkable panels, all apparently done by the same hand. In one of the compositions, a man holding 2 horses by leads crouches within an enclosure. Outside to his right stands a woman, a guardian figure, and 3 figures leading more horses. 2 of these figures are rather strange, long legs and round bodies. They are veritable birdmen. Close by are 2 other similar compositions. In both, a woman stands either in or at the entrance of an enclosure, approached by birdmen and horses. In the upper enclosure, another crouching figure holds the leads of 2 horses. These enclosures must be dwellings, but of the dead. The crouched figures are the dead. The horses, arranged as if to pull a chariot, must refer to the steeds by which the dead would metaphorically travel to the lands of the ancestors. These compositions were clearly executed by the same artist who did the nearby scene of an oryx hunt. In that scene, you recall, a young woman stands beside a hunter as if somehow associated with a hunt. At the very top of the boulder are 2 birdmen with a pair of horses arranged as if to pull a vehicle. But what are these strange figures, half bird, half human, doing here? They seem to project the scene into another space, a world between this one and that of the dead. There is one other composition in this group that must have been executed by the same artist. It helps to explain, but also complicates what we have already seen. A triangular boulder is covered with images of wild animals, horses, stags, ibex, wild boar, and strutting cranes. In the center of this boulder, just above a cleft, is a caravan scene. A woman leads a yak carrying the frame of a yurt and a child, and behind her walks a fine man. On the left side of the panel are 2 vehicles with horses and a small child, actually a girl. In both sections, we see this world through the wings of large birds in flight, or as if from below, looking up at the spread-winged birds. The woman and the loaded yak carry the motif of the threshold, and the animals reaffirm a realm of well-being. There is no visible sign of sickness or death, but the vehicles introduce a note of disquiet. And while the animals and strutting birds conjure a world of abundance through which moves the small household, the birds in flight unsettle our space and perspective and challenge our location to reality. So if you can't see them, yes, here are the birds here. There are quite a few of them. By style and subject, we can date these panels to between approximately 3,300 and 3,000 years before the present. Within their strong narrative expression, we find ourselves balanced between realms of being. The images of dwellings, are they real or do they indicate the next world? The wheeled vehicles, seen in whole or in part, and so poorly prepared to handle the rough terrain of the Altai, they also seem to be a sign of liminal space, the road that the dead must travel to reach the land of the ancestors. The compositions on the high outcrop tell us that by the late Bronze Age, that road was conceived as guarded by a female figure, the distant descendant of the birthing woman. Over the years of working in the Mongolian Altai, it became quite clear that in the Bronze Age rock art of these valleys, there was a strong narrative content, but I could only guess what that content was. The people who had then lived in these mountains had long ago been pushed to the north, displaced by groups who came in from other parts of Mongolia and Central Asia. In other words, there is no continuous narrative record in this part of the world. On the other hand, there are many remnants of ancient cults and myths that have survived among peoples such as the Altaitsi, the Ket, and the Evenk, all of whom originated in or close to this region. Within these cults, the most important is probably that of the mountain, understood as the source and sustainer of a lineage. Even today in Mongolia, one sees signs of the mountain cult in the form of stone piles or obo at passes and on the ridges of mountains. These are frequently decorated with strips of cloth and branches, reflecting the mountain conceived as both axis mundi and tree of life. As we have seen, the mountain was associated with the female who engenders and releases new game. Among the Altaitsi, it was believed that the hunter should sleep with the mistress of the mountain before his hunt. This is reflected in the compositions with hunters in a mountain-like space within an abundance of game, and often in association with female figures or loving couples. A second significant cult, that of the threshold, appears to have great antiquity across Siberia. The form this takes varies, but it is symbolized above all by the fire that centers the dwelling, or in recent times, by the firebox. Whatever the form, the threshold is personified as the clan mother or grandmother. It was understood as a liminal place, the locus of passage, like smoke, from one world to the next. It thus refers to the female guardian of the passage between two worlds. But in rock art, the threshold takes the form of the household, loaded on the back of a yak, and that's almost always led by a female figure. Mythic traditions are more difficult to deal with. Their very antiquity would indicate significant change from the original form, and that change would be heightened by the dispersal of groups out from their native lands. However, throughout the rock art of our area, dating back to before that dispersal, it is possible to find bits and pieces of ancient mythic traditions, many referring to the notion of an originating female source as both part human, part animal. This motif is most vividly reflected in a female antlered animal from whose head emerges the tree of life, and in that tree, the great birds build their nests and feed the next generation of living beings. In at least one large scene, the cults of the mountain and threshold are joined with this mythic tradition. Across a large boulder, which you see here in Bago Oigo 1, are spread small scenes of wild animals and hunters, each within a space seemingly carved out by a winding trail. At the bottom of the panel is a yak loaded with the belongings of a family, and beside that group is the image of a small deer. From its antlers sprout the long tendrils that become the paths leading across the mountain landscape. The deer then is the source of the mountain and its game. The mountain, the threshold, and the deer as generator of all life. This panel gathers together the signs of those cults and myths scattered throughout Bronze Age images. To understand the liminal space between what we call life and death, one must remember that in the Bronze Age, death was all around, on the steppe, on the mountain slopes, in the valleys. It is curious that despite that fact, within the rock art tradition of that period, there are virtually no signs of death, no dying animals, no humans in agony, not a single representation relating to the end of life. One can only ask why that should be, and why within a pictorial tradition that is so naturalistic, there are no signs of death, or rather no signs of death as we understand it. But we have seen that in fact there are many indications that between the two realms, this one, our world, and the other, the land of the dead, there was hardly a separation, only a pathway perhaps, or a river, or a stone trail. This brings me back to the group of compositions on the high terrace in Bago'oigor 3, and to the images of birdmen and great winged birds. Above this outcrop, the rocky ridge rises approximately 100 meters into a place of cliffs and niches and passages before the transition to a high pasture. When I climbed up into this rocky labyrinth, I was struck by the complexity of space within the slope and by the sense of having moved into another world than that represented by the valley floor. Elsewhere, I was puzzled by the appearance of strange stone circles. Seeming to mark places that are otherwise empty. Thinking about those places, I've come to believe that the dead, whose ancient burials we cannot find, were laid out in there on these high cliffs. The chariots refer to death, but the birdmen and large winged birds are images of the great raptors that still live in these mountains. Rotating over the hillsides and cliffs, these soaring birds are the embodiment of the belief embedded in Ket and Evenk myths that from death comes life, that there is no life without death. The birds strip the dead of their flesh and carry it and the bones back to their nests. Perhaps we could say that these pecked birds and birdmen, as well as the chariots, are the last references to the archaic birthing woman, or to her late descendant, the woman who guards the road to the lands of the dead. They reflect the significance of liminality within the pictorial records of the ancient Altai, and within the cosmologies of those people who inhabited these mountains in the Bronze Age. Thank you. And let's see what we can do here. Stop share.
Thank you so much for this really interesting paper. So many things that are super interesting and that also continue the conversation that we just started. And so I'm keeping some questions for later. So thank you, Esther, again. And now it's the turn to have Erica here on the stage. So yes, Erica is a professor of the University of Alaska Southeast, and she will be discussing with us and presenting her paper on watercraft as hybrid assemblages in the Western Arctic. So please.
Okay, I think you can see this, yes?
Yes, absolutely. So
okay, great. So today I would like to talk about watercraft, which are indeed a type of artifact that often we encounter in any society that inhabits the coast. And I'd like to suggest that we take another look at watercraft and look at them from the perspective of animism and materiality, the theme of this conference. Watercraft are really critical components of maritime Arctic toolkits. And the image here is a model of what we call an umiak, and it was used up until the 1960s in the coasts of Alaska and Chukotka, Russia, in the Bering Sea area. And that's what I'll be focusing on today. So just to orient you, I'm talking about the region at the center of this map, which is the Bering Sea area. The area in blue is the modern day Inupiaq of Alaska, folks who live there today and are descendants of earlier Thule peoples. And I'll also be referring to the ancestors of the St. Lawrence Island Yupik, who inhabit the island of St. Lawrence, which is right in the middle of the Bering Sea area. So that's the area I'll be talking about. And here's another map just to give you a more specific view of it. Northwest Alaska, again, the Inupiaq, which is the area here that is shaded with crosshatched lines. And then the red arrow points to St. Lawrence Island. So the people who currently inhabit these two areas of Alaska are the descendants of a very long 3,000 to 5,000 year history of occupation in this area. And it's a subject of great interest to archaeologists when they developed these complex watercraft that today and in the recent past are used for hunting bowhead whales, as well as seals, walruses, and other marine mammals. So here is a historic photo from the late 1800s. And this shows an umiak in the background with a sail. And then there's another type of watercraft, a kayak in front. But I'll be focusing on the umiak. And here you can see it's quite a long vessel. And the fundamental construction is that of driftwood logs, not planks, but logs, that are then fashioned into this long, elongated oval and then covered with sea mammal skins. And the sea mammal skins are usually bearded seal, but also might be walrus. And you can see that you can get a number of people, 20 people, an entire family, extended families used these. And they're used for travel and trade, so movement along the coast in long distances to go to annual trade fairs. And they're also used for hunting, as you might imagine, and as architecture, as shelter. So they can be dragged up onto the shoreline and turned sideways, propped up, and used as temporary shelter, sort of as a windbreak or a camping area. And so they're multifunctional. They're really very important types of if you want to call them artifacts, but material culture. You can see in this image, you can see right here, there is a sealskin float. So that's the body of a seal that has been inflated to be a sealskin float. You can see in here the type of frame, the framework of the umiak, and then stretched over the umiak is a number of skins, usually 3, 4, 5, depending on the size of the bearded seal or walrus. Here's an example of an umiak being pushed across the ice in preparation for a hunt. And you can see both women and men are involved here. You can see how loaded up the umiak is. And again, you can see the construction here with the wood here, the driftwood selected very carefully for its characteristics. And then the overlying skin of the umiak, which is required obviously to be renewed frequently because it takes a lot of wear and tear. So today and in the past, and this is an image of a reconstructed umiak based on historic analogs, the umiak crew is a very integrated part of using an umiak. Each individual within an umiak crew has a specific role, and those roles are enduring. In other words, you don't take a different role every time you go out in the umiak. You have a role as, for example, a steersman in the back, an oarsman, or somebody here up front who is a leader, or more recently, actually not more recently, but in the past, today, people use rifles, but in the past, it would have been someone using a harpoon. The harpooner or striker, who had a very important role as the person who basically attached the harpoon to the prey animal, and then that person had a lot of status associated with him, and it wasn't the kind of role that just anyone could take. So what I've been doing is using ethnographic data from the 1800s in an effort to get at the meaning of archaeological materials. And so that refers to pre-contact Thule people. So these Thule folks are the ancestors of the modern inhabitants of Alaska. Traditionally, those folks have been called Eskimo. We don't tend to use that term very often anymore. We try to refer to them more specifically by the names that they give themselves. So for example, Inupiaq or Yupik, each of those means real people in their respective languages. So I'm looking at Inupiaq and Yupik information, ethnographic data, photographs, and objects in order to reconstruct and get at the meanings and understandings of some of these types of objects that are recovered from archaeological contexts. And watercraft show up in pieces generally in archaeological sites quite prominently. And it's clear from ethnographic data that the umiak was an incredibly important object that occupied people year round, even when they weren't hunting. And it might be due to having to construct or reconstruct an umiak. It might be maintenance of the umiak. It might be collecting materials to create or reconstruct an umiak. As you can imagine, the amount of labor that would have to go into assembling all of the pieces of driftwood, the skins themselves, and then the labor to construct it is incredibly labor intensive. And it's a long-term process that I'd like to suggest we could productively think of as an assemblage, not only of materials, but also of affordances of those materials. And this is not my original idea. I'm borrowing heavily here from Yanis Hamalakis and Andrew Jones's work on assemblages. And I'd like to think of them as the product of a series of relational processes that embrace both the human participants, but also plants, animals, prey animals, as well as the animals that are contributing their skins. Now, we're obviously very familiar with thinking about relational processes among humans, but I'd like to broaden that in the Arctic context to include not just the plants and animals, but also the objects. And of course, you know, as Graham has pointed out, a lot of our words aren't really, our English words aren't really set up to embrace the ideas here. So object doesn't really convey the animism and enlivened characteristics of watercraft that I'd like to try to convey here. But those relational processes don't just include humans, they include the plants, the animals, and the umiak itself. Now, umiaks are the product of a lot of cooperative labor. And in the Arctic, they are traditionally gendered, very gendered products, with women being responsible for the sewing. And you can see here that there are at least 5 women involved right here in the sewing of the umiak, which needed to be recovered every year or so. And so it's difficult to convey the importance and the amount of labor involved in not only obtaining the skins of the animals to use, but then preparing them, sewing them, maintaining them, ensuring waterproof seams. This required really considerable skill, expertise, and really lives depended on your skill as a seamstress. If you didn't produce waterproof seams, if your stitches didn't hold, then the lives of your family members were at risk. This is a very laborious process. And obviously the process here, I'm showing you just a snapshot, but the process began actually many, many months previously with the actual hunting of the animal and the collection of the driftwood. So here is a picture of driftwood. And even though driftwood is quite abundant in many parts of the Arctic, the specific types of driftwood that you would want to use for an umiak is not, you would have to often hunt for that particular piece. You wanted a specific curvature, you wanted a specific type of tensile strength, and not all wood was acceptable. So the process of finding and then converting that wood into something that could be used for an umiak was quite a laborious process. Here is a picture of a bearded seal. Bearded seal skins were preferred for umiak construction, and you didn't want just any bearded seal. Females were often preferred because of the traits, the qualities of their skin. But as I've written about previously, humans had complex relationships with seals, with walruses, with whales. Each of these types of marine mammals, they were all prey animals, but they were also animals with whom humans engaged in relational feedback. They had relationships and observed, as I mentioned earlier today, a certain etiquette. Seals had a society, whales had a society. The rules were different than those of human societies, but if humans didn't observe those rules, then they wouldn't be successful hunting because they basically weren't cooperating. They weren't observing the etiquette that was required for a successful hunt. So bearded seals are really important contributors to the umiak. And when I say contributor, I mean contributor in the sense of a gift giver. Their intentionality was important in constructing an umiak because you wanted to take a seal that had been given willingly to a hunter. And the deal was that the hunter would behave properly toward the seal in the hunting process. His wife would behave properly to the seal in the processing and the sewing process. And then that seal skin would be used to create an umiak that was then used properly to hunt other marine mammals. So it's a very complex relational process here. And we tend to think in Western terms of, oh, it's a dead animal skin. Well, for traditional Inupiaq and Yupik folks, it wasn't a dead animal. It was a skin in a new in a new transformed form, but it was actually still contained some essence of that animal and an awareness, even though it was the animal skin at this point, that awareness was durable. So one of the relationships that has been the focus of a lot of research in the Arctic is that between humans, and you can see here in the modern version of an umiak, which is a small outboard boat, and bowhead whales, gray whales as well, but in this case we see a bowhead. And that relationship has been the product of a lot of academic attention. It is emblematic, even though this is the most dramatic form of that human-animal relationship, it's emblematic of the Thule, Inupiaq, and Yupik relationships with a number of different marine mammals. And I'd like to use it here as my example. In hunting bowhead whales, the structure of the umiak itself was very important. You couldn't be a successful hunter of a bowhead without having the kinds of material objects in the umiak that would facilitate relationships with whales. And one of the objects that people would use is this steersman's seat. And you can see here, it's an absolutely beautiful piece of wood, carefully selected, and then carved in the shape of a bowhead, literally emerging from the wood. And you can see here that the carver has used great facility and artistry in emphasizing the grain of the wood, which sort of recalls the movement of water over an animal's back. And quite interestingly, you wouldn't sit on this side. The seat was actually, you would sit on the flat side. This side was face down. The whale would actually be on the bottom side of the seat as it was installed in the umiak. And I think it's quite interesting to think of this as, obviously for humans, it's upside down, but it's actually right side up for a whale, because the whale could only see it from underneath, from the water underneath. And so the seat was positioned so the whale could see it, not so humans could see it. And I think that's a really interesting way of understanding the human-whale relationship, just by looking at the positioning of this object in an umiak itself. Here's another example, decorated again with some inlay here. And that inlay we understand to be to please the whale, not for humans necessarily. We find it attractive. We find it today, we consider this a piece of art, but really this was intended as a way of honoring and gifting whales, attracting whales. Whales apparently are very attracted to things that are beautiful, especially images of themselves. And the more precious objects and inlays that you would put on a decorative piece like this, what we would call a decorative piece, the more likely a whale would be attracted to it, and therefore a successful hunt could be achieved. These objects are also closely associated with umiak. This is a whaling captain's blade box. And you can see again that these blades, which themselves are quite lovely, are placed inside a whale-shaped box. Again, this is not simply just an object. It's an object of beauty intended for whales to appreciate. There's really a sense that the whales understand what's going on, what humans are doing. Whales can hear when humans are talking about them, which is why it's always important to speak respectfully of whales. And whales, as I've mentioned before, have an incredibly sophisticated aesthetic sense. So they want to see beautiful things and certainly beautiful images of themselves. Here is an example of a whaling captain. And here he is officiating at the spring, basically provisioning. This is when you clean out your ice cellar and you give away all the rest of the meat that you have from the previous year. He's dressed up here in his in finery, and above him he has all of the special objects associated with whaling. There's a bucket to the side. That bucket is for providing whales with a drink of water when they get thirsty, which they do after they've been hunted. There are a number of other ritual objects behind him, and you can barely see right here. I suspect that this is that whaling seat right here, that is part of the whaler's paraphernalia that mark him out as someone with a special relationship with whales. So what I've suggested here is that the umiak itself is most productively conceived as an object being. It's not an object in a Western sense, but it's an object being. And again, this sort of awkward phrasing reflects the fact that English doesn't have an adequate way of conveying these ideas. And again, I'm borrowing here from Ian McNiven's really fascinating work on Torres Strait watercraft in the Pacific region. Ian has described canoes from that area as object beings, and I think his idea, his terms really apply equally to the umiaks of Alaska and the Bering Strait area. So what I've suggested is that these umiaks are the nexus assemblages of multiple sets of relationships. Gendered labor, so labor between men and women, relationships between humans and whales as prey animals, relationships between humans and seals, the bearded seals who provide their skins, relationships between humans and driftwood. And there is a body of anecdotal evidence that suggests that driftwood itself was also perceived as having personhood just like whales, just like seals. These processes produced an animated object being that, in order to have a productive relationship with humans, had to be embraced within this set of rituals and practices that ensured that humans could be successful in their use of the umiak assemblage. And so we have accounts of umiaks being woken up in the spring, rites of renewal when they are being recovered. There are accounts of whaling captains feeding umiaks so that the umiaks are contented and happy to participate. There are chants and songs where captains and their crew members implore the umiak to be attractive and beautiful, to participate, to help out in the process of attracting whales. It was very important for the umiak cover to be white in the spring. Again, whales and their aesthetic sense. And so you wanted to encourage the umiak to participate productively in this relationship and be white, to be clean and fresh looking, so whales would be attracted. Additionally, the umiak itself had its own amulets. So all of this suggests to me that umiaks were themselves object beings. They were persons in their own rights, but very specific types of persons, because they were assemblages of all of these other types of relationships, these affordances of seals and wood and a set of complex human relationships. And so object is really just not a very useful term here. I'd like to think of an umiak as a hybrid assemblage of these relationships that created a new person, this object being, but also embodied these very complex social networks that linked humans with animals, with plants, with the quote unquote natural world. So in other words, to sum up here, umiaks were agential. They had a role in hunting success. They were enlivened through interaction with humans, and they're complex assemblages of relations connecting many different aspects of social relations in the Inupiaq and Yupik worlds. And I would argue to the antecedents, the Thule people, who were some of the early developers of whaling watercraft. Now, because this is a conference that has really pulled together people from a lot of different fields, I'd like to suggest some analogs to other types of assemblages. And one of them I'd like to suggest here is possibly drums. Here's an example of a Sami drum. Other musical instruments may also be considered assemblages. Here you have a skin, you've got a wooden frame, you've got these attachments. Weaponry might also be productively considered an assemblage. And I think it's important here to think of, in many Iron Age societies, weapons were ritually killed. And the idea of killing obviously sort of assumes a sort of personhood. To sum up then, some features of object assemblages that I've been thinking about. These kinds of object beings require a complex multi-step process of quote unquote assembly of affordances. Multiple construction materials all involved, animals, plants, ores, and minerals, for example, in the construction of weaponry. Product of multiple skilled artisans and specialists who engage in this transformational process, creating an object being. Again, creating is enlivening an object being with all of these characteristics of other plants and animals, may be named or characterized with personal attributes. Certainly, we're familiar in the West with naming boats or ships. Weapons such as swords are often named as well. Some of these objects may be inherited or have caretakers or stewards rather than owners per se, because you can't own another person in some of these ontologies. They may have ritualized first and last uses or termination rituals. You can't just throw them away in the way that you might some other kinds of objects. And then, as I've suggested, some possible cross-cultural analogs, drums, weaponry, possibly rock art, which again is a complex assembly, and possibly portable structures. I was thinking of the yurts that were mentioned in the previous talk, but also plain structures in the in North America. Another possibility to look at productively as an assemblage of these affordances. So thank you very much, and I look forward to comments and questions.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Erica. Wow, this is both extremely intriguing and much food for thought, I would say. So now, questions, either, in person. Okay, Nicola, first of our, please.
I don't know, I feel kind of biased because I'm a huge fan of Erica's and Esther's work. And so I have two comments, kind of questions. The first one is to Esther's work in Altai. And I think, Anna, if you can turn out, or somebody would take microphone, because.
Yeah.
And it's been a question that regards the reproduction of animals in ritual contexts. How much is narrative and how much is spirituality? Thinking about Upper Paleolithic, I've been talking about this with Trevor Watkins and other scholars. How much is, for example, like Upper Paleolithic cave paintings or the representation of animals in the Göbekli Tepe? How much do you think is realistic narrative, and how much is a spiritual connection with the underworld or the other world? And this is to Esther. For Erica, it's regards the spirituality of hunting. And it's related to what Tim Ingold have been writing about, the trust between the hunter and the prey. How do you see that in your assemblage concept? Thank you.
So should I try to answer this, Anna? Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I don't think, of course, we do not know for sure with the prehistoric rock art, but my impression is that there was no division between the reality and the spirituality. That there was probably a complex relationship between humans and those images of those animals. What's very striking is that in the animals reproduced in rock art, whether it's in the Paleolithic or down into the Bronze Age, the animals are all, except for the herded ones, they're all large, impressive animals. But the people didn't live just on those things. They lived also on small animals, marmot, rabbit, whatever it may have been. So that the distinction between this, our world and that world, spirit and reality, I think it was very fused, very fused. That's all I can say right now. Let me just say that in ethnography, if we look at Siberian ethnography, it's very similar to what Eric is talking about in her Opiek material. The whole idea of assemblages of things that come together, like the shaman's drum, that are brought together to actually animate this whole ritual. So there is this wonderful lack of division, lack of boundaries, which I find, and which I really heard what you were saying, Erica. I found that very interesting.
So you think the boundaries is just like a Western?
Oh, definitely. Definitely.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, and I would agree. Hunting, and so this is a critique of Ingold that I've been thinking of. Ingold, as you point out, does focus on hunting, and I think he is, I think hunting is only one aspect of a much longer set of processes. And focusing on hunting, we miss everything else. And I think, I'm going to say, I think it's a masculinist approach that misses the gender components of life that we've been talking about. Hunting misses the whole process from the beginning to the end. In order to hunt, you need weaponry. In order to hunt, you need clothing. And clothing as an assemblage is incredibly important. You can't hunt without clothing made by women and made by skilled women who have good relationships with animals. And, you know, so when we talk about hunting and we sort of pull it out of context as this event, I think we're misrepresenting it, because hunt is only one part of a process that goes way, way back to collecting the driftwood that puts, you know, that provides the structure for the umiak, which is sewn by the women who are also sewing your clothing so that you can go out and stand on the ice and you know, look for the whales and then hunt them and then distribute them, feed the whales, you know, share the food and start the process over again. So I really disagree with this idea of, not obviously hunting is incredibly important, but it's only one node in a very complex process that involves men, women, animals, and plants in this process. Because it's so process oriented, it's not ritual per se or religion per se, it's daily practice. It's what you do every day as a matter of course, at least for the groups for the folks I'm talking about.
So basically hunting is not the end of the process, but it's just part of the relationship and it's part of your assemblage basically. Thank you, fantastic. You solve it's like finally going after Ingold. Just like, you know, it's like crossing the bridge. Thank you.
Okay, I wish to ask you something, but I think that there is Seth and also Mari. Okay, Seth asked more of a comment than a question. Erica, I was fascinated to hear about the conceptualization of animals as having an aesthetic sensibility. Me too. And it seems really to stand out beyond a construction projection of animal sociality. So yeah, this is also something that I wanted to
I'll just add only that that's sort of on the level of a fanboy question saying, just say more. I don't have a specific question.
No, this is, you've hit upon something that just fascinates me and really deserves additional attention. Whales, as I mentioned, have this incredible aesthetic sensibility. They're very attracted to images of themselves, which one might see a reflection of human characteristics there. But seals have a different aesthetic. And something that's very important in relating to seals is to have, men must have immaculate clothing. Seals apparently have a very finely honed sense of smell, and they detest dirty clothing. They also really dislike any indication of recent sexual activity. And so winter must really be in pristine condition with not only clean clothes, but well decorated clothes. And seals are incredibly sensitive to this. Therefore, a man whose wife is not a particularly good seamstress or who doesn't take care of his clothing is at risk of being unsuccessful because the seals are just not happy. They're not happy with him. They don't want to come. They're not attracted. With whales, they love jewelry. And one of the best ways to get along with a beluga is to provide them with beads. That they're attracted to beads. So what's fascinating, obviously this whole thing is fascinating, but that these different animal species have different preferences and different types of sociality, different characteristics. It's just fascinating. And I haven't gotten to explore to what extent these perceived preferences line up with biological characteristics. For example, I don't know, do belugas have especially keen eyesight? Do seals have especially good sense of smell? I've actually looked into the literature and I can't find anything about seals' smelling ability. But I do suspect that Inupiaq folks are correct, that seals do indeed have a keen sense of smell. So yes, thank you for your question.
Great, thank you.
No,
Like,
it's
if we want to go to Alaska, we don't have to look at boots, but we have to look at dressed well with tuxedos, I guess.
my question is exactly about Erica, about this aesthetic. It's just mind-blowing, I must say. But these informations you collected, let's say, from the elders, from the community, I mean, from ethnographic or from other kind of I don't know, scientific, let's say, literature. So your sources are in the people. Yeah, that's amazing. May I also ask you a question, and then I leave the word also to Mari. As my great passion is about the vegetal world, and I also believe that there is a kind of cultural gender bias about plants. That's why, you know, there's a lot about animals, and I appreciate animals. I really love animals, but I think that also plants have been a bit too much neglected. And how do you perceive that? I mean, also about your research, because as you said, women especially, you know, are in charge of knowing the different botanical species and processing food and the healing. And returning to also Nicola, question about spirituality is never, I believe, I think only, you know, bodily healing is always intermingled with the spiritual and the physical. So what would you say about the world of plants? What you mentioned about the driftwood having a personhood also?
I think you've hit right there on an area of study that is incredibly productive and really deserves a lot more attention. I have not been able to find very much on relationships with driftwood, at least in the area I'm working on. There are, again, anecdotal accounts that, for example, one might have a good relationship with wood if one is walking along the beach and sees a piece of driftwood that is getting weathered on one side, and one might want to push it over so it will feel better. You know, so there's this sense that there's this animacy in that piece of wood that is responsive to human behavior. Certainly parts of Alaska, women who collect plant products, tree bark, for example, or spruce roots, they need to have good relations with those trees. They need to speak to them, to sing to them, to chant to them, to thank them for offering bark and spruce root. And the only way that you can come back and again take more bark and spruce root is by behaving properly and being thankful for it. So very much personhood invested in at least certain kinds of plants, trees especially, and medicinal plants also seem to be very associated with this personhood. And unfortunately, that's all I can say about it. Again, Thank you for working on this topic, which deserves a lot more attention.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Mary, that's your turn. Sorry for coming a bit later.
Sorry, been sitting here quietly and now I can't find my voice. I was also really struck by the comments on aesthetics, but also just by how beautiful all the pictures were from both of your presentation. As someone who works on text, I'm always a little bit jealous of people who have actual objects. And I wondered, if, Esther, if you could, I realize you have to speculate, but the rock carvings are all so beautiful. And what do you think the role of sort of making beautiful things in relating to liminality, what that might have been, or if you have any thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Mari. Thank you, because I'm so utterly convinced that there was a strong, what we would call aesthetic concern. And it exists on several levels when we look at the rock art. One is that the people who executed the rock art very frequently chose the most beautiful rocks that were scraped and polished by glacier, that had been through mineralization, had changed coloration. so that there was a sense of a canvas there. The second thing that's very striking is that they frequently would have a sense of a narrative extension across a whole rock face or several rock faces. But it's so clearly obvious from the materials that I showed you today, particularly those from Bagoy Gore 3, but from many others, that there were artists who understood how to manipulate their pecking instruments and the rock face. And they did it with extreme care. It's fascinating how so many of these figures, for example, are beautifully shaped. The men have lovely calves. The women are very well, shaped. The animals have magnificent racks. Now, this is not true at all, because you have artists and then you have everybody else. But it's clear that there must have been a great concern for the expressive, the fine and the expressive form. What does this have to do with liminality? I cannot, all I can do is speculate. And I would say that it must have heightened the sense of that porousness or the dissolution of the boundary between one form and another. These people saw the beauty of the animals in the real world. And I think that the artists were the ones who really replicated it or tried to replicate it in their rock art. I hope that answers you a bit. Uh-huh.
Maori?
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I just said yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry.
Yes, that's very helpful.
Okay, I see there is a question by Federico Squarcini. Please come in, jump into the conversation.
Yeah, I have the same question to both of you, Erica and Hester. To Hester, more precisely related to because as you said, while you were giving your answer about projection of boundaries, and you say that definitely is our own product. There are no boundaries down there. So when you were speaking about this world and the other world, this kind of transferring through, so the sign of something was meant to make a statement about speciality. There are other places and some sort of other places. So I'm wondering about that, and which is the same problem that I have with when Erika was making the statement on any animated beings or things that got animated. Again, it seems to me that if I'm looking at both of your presentation from the point of view, like people like Gibson, the ecology of experience or perception, well, within the ecology of perception, it's very difficult to make a statement about what I perceive to be here and to be far away from here. So from the point of view of the ecology of perception, and that's why I'm wondering, it's very relevant that we can mix together 3,000 years old rock painting and artifacts used by guys to cover themselves during a very cold winter after being into the sea. So this kind of transmutation it exhibited that the entire idea of liminality is a problem.
Okay.
So I'm wondering, like being a Sanskritist, and therefore the sign of the text make me feel that there is a white page. So there is something on the page that I can derive from and to decide what that means. So I'm a textual scholar. But by looking at Esther's presentation and Erika's presentation, again, here, I have the problem of establish when a box or when a rock means something else, which is like to me, to Erika. So for you, Esther, it's about, can you share your thoughts on liminality in that frame? And to Erika, can you share your thoughts on the idea of establishing a boundaries between what these guys were doing with those boats and what someone today in Chicago is doing with his own computer while he is speaking with the computer? What you are doing? Now, we we behave like they behave in a way that we speak with our computers. What are you doing? No, guys speak to the computer when the computer crashed down. They say, what are you doing? Or the computer is doing. The computer is not doing anything. Or the computer is doing everything. So from the ecology of perception, and these two papers are very interesting to be merged and blended, make me wondering about boundaries between things and boundaries between us and them. You know, today we are not doing the same because they were doing other things. Are we sure how we can establish that boundary between what they were doing with their own boats, what we are doing with our own cars? People, when they crash the car, they feel sad. They feel damaged. So please, if you have something in mind, I would wonder too. Thank you.
Your question's a good one, and it's a fair one. So what I have always done or been interested in is ethnography, of Siberian ethnography, and trying to trace ethnographic traditions back to where they were, say, in the Bronze Age. And wherever you look in this ethnography, including in rock art itself, you see images that refer to, or let's say in the ethnography, that liminality is very clear. Rocks become ways into the earth. Trees become ways up into the heavens. There's a clear sense of a land of the ancestors. Rivers, and you see that rivers in the images that I showed you, you always saw a river. Rivers were always a pathway to another world. So that in a sense, you might say, our understanding of different spheres or realms is not so terribly different from what, say, the people believed in, I think, in the Siberian world. But there was a blending, a merging, a moving. And that's where I think the idea of liminality becomes a little more subtle, perhaps, than what we have if I crash my car. Okay, Erica, what do you want to say?
Wow, there's so much rich material here, and I've got lots of thoughts on it. But I'm aware that we haven't got unlimited time. The idea of geography has come up before in earlier talks, and I have a sense that geography is incredibly important to a lot of the ideas that we're talking about here. And I've been thinking about what I'm sort of calling intimate geographies of human relations with things, with animals, with computers. There's with cars, perhaps. There's an intimate geography of relationships, of sensuality when one, types or drives or processes a seal or paints on a rock art panel. And you're engaging in this liminal, you're going over boundaries, you're interacting with another thing, another person, another way of being when you paint, when you skin an animal, when you drive. So I find geography and spatial orientations to be a useful way of thinking about this. On a larger scale, there are geographies of, say, the village, which is a very human space in the Arctic. But in order to hunt, one must leave a human space and go into liminal spaces like the sea ice, which is both human space and animal space. You don't want to actually go into whale space, which is the water, because that's not set up for humans. It's set up for whale persons, right? But you do need to engage with those liminal spaces in order to successfully hunt. And there are lots of practices and rituals that are required for one to engage safely in that way. Other liminal spaces that I think of, sea ice is a really obvious one, but the coast and the beach areas are obviously liminal spaces. In the Southeast Alaska, where the spruce root example came from, the edges of rivers are really very liminal because salmon have their own space in the river, but humans must go to the river edge, which is this liminal space between human space and salmon space in order to fish. there's lots to be had there. Kristen Armstrong-Oma has talked about this as human-animal meeting places. And I think of it as a very useful idea because it's a liminal space can be a very social interactive space, but it doesn't necessarily quote unquote belong to humans or animals or perhaps to plants. It's a meeting space where those different sets of relations are enacted. And
could I just
so much to your question though.
Could I just add something to what Erica was saying? The issue of geography. It's not just the boundaries and the directionality, but for example, where I work in Mongolia, it is, you never can look anywhere without having a sense of extension of space. And the sense of extension, that is of change and movement, is emphasized by wind that comes, sound that comes, animals that move. The world is in movement. And that very movement is, and movement in space and in time, that very movement is, I think, a key to that understanding of living in a zone of liminal zone.
Oh, so if you don't have any question, there's another question. I mean, it's wonderful and it's very, rich, all this conversation. So if Federico Squarcini, you don't have any other notes, of course, we will continue probably in these discussions tomorrow. So there is a question by Dalila Alberghino, that she says, thank you so much to both speakers. These topics are incredibly fascinating. I have two questions. One for Esther. I imagine how elusive in this region, but I was wondering if there is any identifiable pattern in the way our rock reliefs are distributed in relation to the natural and anthropogenic elements of the landscape. Are they specifically clustered in proximity of the main passage routes, demark the location of burial mounds, or both? While for Erica, could you tell us more about the termination ritual for the Umiaks? Also, are they ever incorporated in any way into Chul's funerary practices? Once again, many thanks to all the speakers and organizers. Okay, I see that Erica already wrote something too. Yeah. So
okay.
Please.
Let me try to respond to this question. It's a very good question. And like all of these questions, they actually entail a far more complex answer than I can give now. But rock art, the first thing about rock art is it only happens where there's rock and where there's good rock. And the good rock is almost always going to be in the high mountain areas. Mm-hmm. Lower, it cannot be actually used. So that sort of limits it, you might say. But what then is very striking and again relates back to the earlier question about liminality, is that there are some valleys that are very heavily covered with rock art, kilometers covered with rock art, and other places where it's just a little bit here and a little bit there. And I think that what we're looking at are valleys that were the ones that are dense, valleys that allowed many people during the summer or months in the prehistory to move through and to sojourn. Whereas the small little places, concentrations, would indicate that habitation was very ephemeral. And that's the main thing that way. But I think that what's interesting about your question is that the concentration of imagery is and combined with the period of that imagery starts to give us a sense of the movement of people through space and in time. Okay. Thank you.
Something that occurred to me while Esther was talking, I wonder, is it possible for some of the rock art to be intended for non-humans, for perhaps the audience isn't human at all, but the audience is perhaps the elk themselves, or there are some examples in Alaska that I suspect are not meant for humans at all. They're made by humans, but they're not made for humans to see. And this is suggested by their locations in some places, which are very near water, where humans actually have to quite contort themselves in order to have made the rock art in the first place and to view it in the second place. I suspect some rock art around the world might not have a human viewer in mind. But again, I'm not a rock art specialist, so it's just a question actually more than anything else. Is that a possibility, Esther?
Yeah, I think that actually not major where we are, but I think that the figures that I call spirit figures, and for example, the ones with the horns, they frequently, I think, were intended to be seen by other spirit world, okay? In fact, perhaps even more so. Or they represent a way into that spirit world. But the hunting scenes, for example, or the yaks, I don't think they were thought of particularly for the animals, okay? But I can't tell you for sure.
There was a question about termination rituals. And I've written about this elsewhere with regard to other kinds of materials, but yes, the answer is yes. Umiaks and umiak associated objects, I'm thinking about them in using a term called sacra, the Latin term sacra, sort of enlivened objects. Any enlivened object, any object that isn't just an object, it can't just be thrown away like household trash. It has to be treated in a particular way. And there are socially acceptable ways of disposing of these enlivened objects. And yes, one of the ways was by placement of these objects in or on or around the interment of individuals. In northern Alaska, traditionally folks were laid out on the tundra and possibly covered up with rocks. You can't bury people really very much part of the year because of the permafrost. So people were laid out, and sometimes their goods were simply adorned the area where they were laid out. And so I've seen historic photographs of entire kayaks sometimes laid near deceased, paddles, buckets, and in one case, this was quite interesting, an early 1900s example of a sewing machine, so sewing objects, really some interesting treatments, but there's definitely the sense that you can't dispose of these kinds of materials in the same way that you would dispose of quote unquote trash. Certainly marine mammal bones had to be treated in very specific ways because they're not trash at all. They're actually parts of those animals, and those animals are still inhere in the bones themselves. And so you have to deposit them in very particular ways.
Okay, any other questions? Seth, I don't hear you. I saw you talking, but speaking.
I'm sorry, I was asking my son if he wanted to eat the last slice of pie.
Sorry. Okay, that's a good question. I don't know. Are there other notes, remarks, comments? I mean, we have 10 minutes, but we can wrap it up for today. I might just provoke another question, though it can lead to a broader discussion, but just because, Graham, where are you? Are you still with us? I would like to just touch, as also Nicola did, the matter of spirituality and also spirits, and again with deities. So this it's kind of, I know that new animism, sometimes we just try to skip the word spirits, but I assume it in a way of other than human persons, right? At least. And so I'm wondering also if you would like to just say something about also the spirit world, as a probably, and this will go also to what Federico Squarcini just asked, about the fact that it's not supernatural or it's not beyond, but it's much within. And that's something that I believe is very also true for ancient Mesopotamia and other ancient cultures, and as much as ethnographical cultures. So when I think about the shamanism or the different ways of shamanism, it's like the shaman is talking and, you know, using his etiquette and his protocol toward the larger than human community that is in the landscape, within the landscape. Then of course there is a, you know, up and down, there are different geographies and cosmologies, but yeah, maybe it's a bit too broad, but please, who wants to get a final notes about it, or just for today? Tomorrow there will be more.
So do you want me to respond to that a little? So I have a problem with one of the other problems with the phrase "other than human persons" is that people keep interpreting it to mean spirits. So I've resisted talking about spirits precisely because I want to get people to think about the larger than human world that might actually be evident to, quote, straight scientists as well. So hedgehogs are other than human persons and so on. Then doesn't have to get mystical and spiritual and all that. But my other problem with the word spirit is that it's like the word animal or the word plant. It's a too big a category when there may be very different kinds of being who you, me, the Yupiak, the Maori and others might think of as kind of within that spirit community, but they have specific names for different kinds of being. And I think we've, in English at least, collapsed all that diversity into beings that don't exist or beings that are invisible or some other kinds of mistakes about the nature of those beings. So in British folklore, there are, because we are a multi-ethnic origin, we have the fairy folk, the Sidhe, the elves, the boggarts, and a dozen other kind of beings who are all very different and behave differently towards humans, some of whom you want to invite into your house, but don't give them clothes, don't give them milk except for Samhain, Halloween, May Eve and so on. Then you put it outside, you thank them, but don't make them like your servants. Other spirits, you don't want anywhere near your house. They'll steal your bride, your baby, your husband. You won't be seen for 70 years and all that stuff. So there are all kinds of problems in using the word spirit. But on the other hand, I may have gone too far in avoiding talking about those beings because they are part of these cosmologies, these communities for many animist groups. So as is true of deities and ancestors and other kind of big groupings. So I do need to try and find a way to talk about those without making people immediately think that animism is about, again, like Edward Tyler, belief in spirits. So that's my rant over with.
No, thank you, Graham. But I felt compelled to raise this issue because it's part of it, and it's also good to talk about it and try to get to a new common ground, or at least to create a broader conversations about these issues. Yeah. So thank you very much. And yes, Erica, please.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on what Graham has said. I found it actually useful to distinguish between agents and persons. And I'm going to use an Arctic Alaska example. There are many types of persons out there, some of whom are animals, but we also have in Alaska little people, and there lots of folks have little people, but we have little people, and a human can interact with little people as long as you observe certain kinds of behaviors. You stay away from their spaces unless you want to be stuck underground for many years, and there's all these other, you can give them offerings and et cetera, et cetera. So there are rules, and humans can get along with them, and I would consider those persons. But there are also spirits, although I wouldn't call them spirits. There are also these very malicious agents out there that can have effects on humans, but they don't observe rules, and humans really don't have very many options in dealing with them. There aren't any practices or rituals you can use to get along with them. And my personal favorite example is the cannibal baby. Is a feature that occurs very commonly in northern Alaska. It's also sometimes called the big mouth baby. And you can either escape and run away from them, or you can kill them, but there's really no other options. They don't observe any rules. They have no culture. They have no personhood. They're merely these ravenous beings. It's really quite awful. They eat their ways out of their human mothers. And cannibalize everyone. They're fantastic beings, and by fantastic I mean extraordinary. But they're fundamentally different in the sense that you can't negotiate with them, you can't relate to them. And so I categorize them as agents rather than persons because they don't observe any rules, and they're fundamentally antisocial.
Yeah. That's great, and it's very much like the Wendigo further east, much further east. And it's intriguing then that the Jesuits were sometimes thought to be Wendigo because they were taking and not giving back. There wasn't a kind of reciprocity. So exactly that. How do you can't negotiate with these people or these beings? So exactly that maybe we need a richer language, that there are persons who are kin, and then there are these Wendigo cannibal beings, and most cultures have these cannibals who are not negotiable with, just run away. And on that basis, the phrase little people in British and I think in Irish mythology, you use that precisely because they're not little. Therefore, they don't recognize that when you're saying those words, they don't know you mean them, so they don't come and get you. So it's kind of nice avoidance language. So.
Yeah, you pointed out reciprocity, and I think a fundamental characteristic of cannibalism, and of course cannibalism shows up in a lot of societies, is the fundamental lack of reciprocity in cannibalism, right? Yeah. And the violation of norms. In a Inupiaq society, as in many traditional societies, sharing and not being voracious and ravenous is incredibly important characteristic of a human person, a real human person who observes rules, is you don't consume voraciously, you share. And so cannibalism is fundamentally opposed to that human characteristic of sharing and reciprocity. And reciprocity, I think, is really important in our definitions of personhood.
Okay, that's wonderful. And that I said, is there another question? And then
it's not but just to follow up really quickly, is in Sumerian proverbs, animals are used exclusively to critique exactly those kinds of bad behaviors which are, can't be regulated by law. They're not crime, they're not, civil infractions, that kind of thing. And it is precisely animals that are used to critique and comment on those kinds of, greediness and vanity and all that sort of thing. So very, very interesting.
Are there types of animals that are associated with that, and other types that are more like domesticated wild? Is that a distinction that's important?
Yes, it is. Although wild animals don't really get to comments at all.
Okay, wonderful, really wonderful, and so much to digest for this first afternoon together. And so I think we are perfectly on time, so around the supposed time to wrap it up for today. So if Nicola, you don't have any other comments or remarks, I would just say
very fascinating, and I hope we're going to talk more about the spirits tomorrow and how to destroy the concept of spirituality at the end of this workshop. But, thank you very much. It was a great day, and see you tomorrow. I think Anna, you will send the link for tomorrow's Zoom room.
I will. That's what I wanted to just the final note. right now, I mean, in a few minutes after another coffee or something, I will send you all the link for tomorrow's session. So yeah, we didn't destroy really spirituality. There will be more chats tomorrow, and let's see how we end up.
I think the Europeans can move into spirits and drinking some Aperol spritz at the end of this. I think the Americans are still like in the lunchtime kind of time zones. I don't know exactly, but around there. So it's been great, and thank you all, and see you tomorrow.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.